This is the November 2nd meeting of the Planning Commission, and we're about to have one more member join us, and we'll begin with roll call.
Chair Spears.
Present.
Vice Chair Hutt.
Here.
Commissioners Catalano.
Here.
Dennison.
Here.
Desai.
Here.
Fryerman Hunt. And Pevsner.
Here.
Okay. I need approval of the agenda for tonight's meeting.
So moved.
Second.
It's been moved and seconded. All those in favor say aye.
Aye.
Those opposed? Excellent. And now we will move on to the approval of the minutes of October 19th. Are there any additions or corrections to those minutes?
Yeah, I have a couple of minor comments on line 10. It says that I called the meeting to order, but actually Bob did, Chair Spears, and then he had to recuse himself later. And then on line 141, where it says additional fenestration would be acceptable to be reviewed at staff level, it should say additional fenestration on the east elevation, because the west elevation is close to the property line and we didn't want any additional windows there. Yeah.
Yeah, definitely concur with that one.
You caught the one that I caught, so any other additions or corrections to the minutes of October 19th?
Well, if not, I will move approval of the minutes of October 19th with the noted corrections.
Second that.
Moved and second. All those in favor?
Aye.
Aye.
Opposed? Okay.
Abstain.
All right, one abstention. At this time, any person may address the Planning Commission concerning any item that is not listed on the agenda. The Planning Commission welcomes your participation and input. When addressing the Planning Commission, please begin by stating your name and address for the record. Please limit your comments to no more than 4 minutes in order to provide an orderly and timely meeting. Seeing no one, we will then begin with our agenda items. We'll go to staff.
We do have a continued discussion item, which is the non-conforming uses ordinance, and the planning manager, Leticia Cardosa, will be giving that staff report.
Thank you. Good evening, Chair and Commissioners. As you recall, at the meeting on October 19th, Chair Spears volunteered as a new member of the Nonconforming Uses Ordinance Subcommittee to assist in drafting recommended changes to the ordinance, as well as amendments to the Commercial Zone Ordinance and related adaptive reuse issues under variances and discretionary permits ordinance, as well as the Historic Preservation Ordinance. At this meeting, the Commission will consider the subcommittee's proposed changes to the Nonconforming Uses Ordinance. Additionally, as part of the potential amendments to the Commercial Zone Ordinance, staff is recommending that the Commission consider adding single-room occupancy, known as SRO, as an allowable use in this zone in compliance with the city's 2014-2021 housing element adopted in January of 2014, requiring that the city provide a variety of housing types, including SROs, to meet the housing needs of all economic segments of the population. According to the housing element, SRO residences are small one-room units occupied by a single individual and may either have shared or private kitchen and bathroom facilities. They are rented on a monthly basis, typically without a rental deposit, and can provide an entry point into the housing market for extremely low-income individuals, formerly homeless, and disabled persons. At this time, staff seeks direction from the Planning Commission, and the red lines and final draft are attached, as well as a matrix showing originally what staff, some of the issues that staff was recommending to be considered by the Commission in amending the Nonconforming Uses Ordinance, and the subcommittee has provided some notes indicating where those items have been included in the redlined ordinance for your review and comment. So with this, I am concluding the staff report.
Okay.
Might be helpful to sort of just, before we dive into the non-conforming ordinance, just talk about a little bit. Let me give you a report on where the subcommittee's at we have the non-conforming ordinance that we can look at tonight. And I think when we get there, the first place to do would be this table that talks about what the different issues that were raised. We also had the issue of adaptive reuse of historic landmarks and bed and breakfasts, and we've done a revision on that and sent it to staff, so hopefully we'll see that in the near future. We're working on the commercial code redo, and we'll talk a little bit about SROs tonight and how we deal with those. And we did have another meeting. We're also doing outreach to the Chamber of Commerce and real estate brokers to get their input. I know that one of the prior meetings, we had some people come and talk about issues of trying to get Pilates studios in, and it wasn't. We want to get sort of a more general and broader input. So that's sort of where we're at, and I think getting to the non-conforming ordinance, we redlined the revised ordinance versus Pasadena's, because that's what we used as a basis as we discussed at last meeting. But because we moved some sections around, the redlining is pretty unhelpful, because it shows some things as like entirely stricken instead of just moved. Because for some reason, when they talked about rebuilding after a casualty, they had a separate part for non-res and then a part for res, and we thought it'd be simpler just to combine those into one section. So when we did that, it made the redlining pretty hard. So that's why, at Letitia's suggestion, we came up with this table that really shows the different issues and how we address them. And so maybe it makes sense to go over this table to try to get the general understanding, and then if we want to go over any of the particular language. And there's a couple areas in particular that I want to focus people on to make sure we're all on the same page. So,
Go ahead.
Do we intend to go through the clean version?
I think what I think, I guess it depends how much you want to talk about it. If we went through the table and then we could look at the clean version, really just sections that people have concerns with.
Yeah, okay, because I've marked up the clean version
Yeah.
with notes,
The-
but not the matrix.
The red line is very, it's hard to keep everything in your head as you read through what's in and what's out.
Okay.
But the table, I want to commend staff, the table is excellent, and it helps us at least see juxtaposition, what's in, what's out, it's easier to follow. And then I agree with John, we can look at the elements in what we've created or what's been created to get your feedback. This is a process that is still ongoing. The committee communicated both electronically and in person, and we brought up a lot of whatabouts and tried to work through it. We've tried to sculpt this to the needs of Sierra Madre. I commend John because he has carried the yeoman's load on this. We contributed concepts, but he's done the bulk of this work and has done an excellent job at it. So, but the creation of the table was staff, and I think it's a good place to start. By the way, you also have a map of the city in front of you that may be helpful in terms of what areas of the city are we talking about and what areas of the city will be impacted. And sometimes you can't. It's helpful to keep all that in your head in terms of like, well, what will this mean when it hits the ground in Sierra Madre? You want to pick up on the table? Are we okay with that? I think it's Exhibit D. Is that right? Yeah?
Yeah.
Could I ask a preliminary question?
Absolutely.
Being that
We want discussion on this.
New to the conversation on this, the non-conforming issue. How big a problem or how big what's the impact on the city? I don't know if you're fielding 100 different items a year or 3 on this where they are. Could somebody give me 25 words or less on what the real order of magnitude is, the amount of impact that this has?
It's pretty constant. It's not 3 per year. It's actually a lot more than that. And it is widespread in the city. Of course, we deal a lot more on a normal basis with residential properties. And I don't know exactly the statistic, but 8 out of 10, when people are adding things to their homes or garages or accessories, oftentimes they run into a nonconformance issue. With respect to commercial, it's typically in the parking. Parking is often the nonconforming issue for the commercial zone. There's, you know, so it varies depending on what you're dealing with, but because primarily we deal with residential, single family throughout the city in different zones, it does come up on a normal basis. And the ordinance in place today that is in the code is grossly lacking in
I think you're
sections
being,
that-
you're kind.
Yeah, you're being very kind.
It's pretty much unworkable. I think
Yeah.
one of the issues is, you know, if you sort through all of our zoning code, you know, some is better than other, and, you know, there's places where we've identified some holes, and some of them there's workarounds, but the problem is the non-conforming ordinance is just junk, and it doesn't really help at all. And that's one of the reasons why, instead of amending it, we said, we looked at other cities, and staff, I think, brought us South Pass, and I forget the other one. And so we said, look, we're just going to start with Pasadena's ordinance and then make it work for Sierra Madre instead of taking our old ordinance, which just basically doesn't function. And so that's why I think there's an issue of frequency, which is some, but the bigger problem is actually how it works, and it doesn't.
Got it.
And whenever we need it, it never
Yeah.
works. There's nothing there for
Okay.
it.
If I can, every time the city updates its zoning, changes a regulation, the properties that are already there that developed under the previous zoning or the previous regulation becomes what's known as legal non-conforming. We're not going to require that property to come up to the new standards, but it's legal non-conforming, and under the law, legal non-conforming uses are considered disfavored. The law looks at legal non-conforming uses as something that you want to amortize away and eventually get rid of. That is a policy call. So that's why there are so many different kinds of, so many different approaches to how you deal with non-conforming uses, which is why you have different types or different ordinances from different cities. But every city has to have an ordinance explaining how are we going to deal with a legal non-conforming use. What happens if somebody wants to expand the use that they have at the site, but it's not an allowable use today under today's zoning? That's an example of one of the things that a legal non-conforming ordinance, a good one, will guide you and tell you how do you handle that. What happens if they stop that use for some period of time and then want to come back and do it again? What's the period of time that we should consider the use gone forever if it's ceased? There are all different kinds of issues, and a good legal non-conforming use ordinance helps us have sensible, rational, and reasonable regulations that help people that live here. And but it's you know, it takes a lot of work, and thank goodness that the subcommittee has put that work in order to decide how do we want our legal non-conforming use to work. Some are very strict, some are more broad. It's really a policy call. But you start with the point legally, they're really considered non-favored, and we want to get rid of them.
Although it sounds as though, since most of what you deal with is residential, that a lot of what this does is just giving you a clean way of addressing the structural nonconformance.
One of our responsibilities is to try to keep code current to the needs of the city. And we've been very fortunate that the staff has, we've asked staff to bring us ordinances and language that is outdated and not productive. Normally, we find it as we do our regular business with people who bring us projects. We find out what part of the code is not working. Here, they brought us the code that we currently have is indecipherable. You can't figure out what is done, and it hamstrings their job in their office. So we've been lucky to have, because the moratorium and the drought has given us a little more time to look into the codes that we do have and try to make them usable and workable for our city. So this is an additional accomplishment for this commission, and you know, I commend staff for finding what does not work and allowing us to, you know, make it right.
Mhm. Okay, so this really has very, very broad application.
Yeah.
Oh, yeah.
And in a lot of ways, there's many more layers to consider than just a straight zoning code, because if you're going to build, whether it's residential or commercial or what have you, you think of, okay, I've got a blank piece of land and I'm going to build a structure, right? But there's something there already, and it may or may not comply with code, and it may or may not comply with code in differing ways, and then you're going to potentially change the use or add to the structure, and so you have to think of all these different layers at the same time. So we went through this a number of times and found it helpful to slow down and sort of consider a lot of different options. And I think your point about the structure is really one of the key issues, and we talked about this a lot at our prior full Planning Commission discussion, and I think you can see that sort of reflected in the first two boxes on the title. I'm in the table, which is, one, the title, and two, the purpose. And our current code just really deals with uses and conflates the issue of structures and uses. And so we've changed the title to say non-conforming uses and structures. Pasadena has this issue of lots, but that's really not a big concern for us. The uses issue really isn't as big an issue for us as it is for other places, because for the most part, residential stuff is residential. There's a few wonky things in commercial, but not a whole bunch. East Montecito's East Montecito. But, you know, in a lot of cities like Pasadena, where we crib this from, they have issues of liquor stores proliferating that are problems and nuisances, and they can't get rid of them. And so those are some issues that we really don't have, and we didn't need to import their language or their concepts in that. And then the other thing is, as Terry was saying, is the general concept is that nonconformances are disfavored and you want to get rid of them. And our current ordinance has parts about phasing things out and within 55 years, some weird language. And really, we talked a lot about this, didn't we? And we thought, we don't really want to phase out our nonconformances. I mean, that's the entire canyon is nonconforming, at least structurally. And so that's part of its charm. And so what we really want to do is have an ordinance that says, well, how do you deal with these nonconformances? And if somebody wants to modify their structure, you know, what do you do? And then also, one of the big thrusts of the updated general plan is adaptive reuse of structures, as opposed to just demoing and building, you know, the dreaded McMansion. And so in the purpose section in 1756-010, we tended to eliminate references to discourage and eliminate, and we brought in more the concepts of encouraging adaptive reuse.
I noticed that language changed.
And so that's really from a you know, a broad policy level where we want to go. We want to be clear about when we're regulating the nonconformance of use versus structure, because we were just ambiguous on that in the past. And then we want to say, well, how do we deal with it, and how do we facilitate adaptive reuse, as opposed to phasing it out or getting rid of it or turning the canyon into, you know, Hastings Ranch.
Yeah, I've been dealing professionally recently with a project in another jurisdiction, and their non-conforming ordinance, but to the point of what you were saying a minute ago, they do have a number of fairly unctuous uses that are scattered about in their commercial district.
And one of the things that
They want to be able to phase those out.
Right.
and our existing code has uses that are listed. Unfortunately, time changes, and there are things in there that the things that were listed aren't there now, you know, are coming up, and so that list has to be dynamic, and we can't meet every year and look at the list and update it. So we have to look at intensity and other kinds of things and impact. And so why don't we
Yeah, let's chunk through this.
Let's, yeah.
Okay, the third line on the table talks about applicability, and what this really gets to is the fact that if it was legal non-conforming, in other words, it was legal when they did it, but it's not legal now, it's grandfathered, then we're gonna apply these non-conformance standards. But what we're not gonna do is if somebody built something illegally, we're gonna let them use this. And that's really what this gets at, and that concept is pretty bedrock, and so we just tracked Pasadena's language on that. We didn't, you know, there's not really any need for a local change on that. That's really fundamental.
Do we have any issues with that in terms of, I mean, I get that if that happened, you know, in the recent past where someone illegally put up a structure, no one knew about it, that's, you know, non-conforming, but
Right.
we're not gonna allow it. But
Like on Highland.
on projects where, I mean, stuff built a long time ago where we don't
Where you don't have
know-
records.
I mean, are we just taking that stance where, well, if we didn't have permits, we don't know?
Yeah, I mean, you get an evidentiary issue at that point, but if it's built in 1904 and there's no permits on file,
We're gonna assume it's a legal structure, but it's non-conforming.
yeah. I mean, I think you're gonna have inevitable evidentiary issues, and I don't know that there's any great way to deal with that.
What happens behind the counter on that issue?
It's very interesting that you ask that, because that does happen a lot, actually. And the problem with that is that, well, if we don't have the permit, then it's not legal. Well, if the house is from 1924, we don't even have a permit for the house,
Yeah.
much less some addition in the back. So that's where the difficulty comes. And what do you apply to that if somebody says, well, can I just, you know, do I leave that there? I need to demo in order to reconstruct because it's what have you. It does become a little difficult. Another thing that becomes difficult is when you have things that have been converted over time. And people have bought those properties over and over on the assumption that I can get this multifamily use out of the R1 property where we have no record of that have ever been zoned R3 at any point in time. Now somebody bought that at a value that is of a multifamily property, and what happens now? And they want a letter saying, well, if it burns down, can we reconstruct? And that's where we run into the issue of, well, you can reconstruct the structure, but you can't reinstate that use because there's not. So yes, we do run into things either use or
structure.
or
both.
structure. Yes, and it's difficult. I mean, it.
So, but right now, do you go under the assumption if it's of a certain date or age or period that, and we don't have records to prove there was a permit on the structure, for example, is that then considered a legal non-conforming structure because you can't prove it either way? I mean, at some point you gotta, is that the assumption you go
Well,
in with?
turn that one around, guys.
I think you kind of have to, because otherwise, otherwise you penalize even the house, because you won't
Exactly.
even have a permit for the house. You kind of have to, because there is nothing else to go by.
If it's clearly before there was a building department, clearly before there were any building permits, okay, you can't say it's illegal because it wasn't done illegally. It was just beforehand.
And
where
do we
And the
know,
type
like,
of
what is,
construction sometimes
something that's
also.
more recent, that's quite potentially, seriously, you know, has the possibility of being a bootleg, then that's where the difficulty is. But otherwise, it's just pre-legal. It's not, can't be
Right.
called
And
illegal.
the type of construction sometimes also, you can, you know, if it was from the 70s, for example, well, you
Right.
should have had a permit for that in the file. But if it's something that looks like, no, this is clearly, you know, the foundation is rubble, what have you, then it is
And
old
also,
enough.
I think there's things where you can see a house was built a certain way and then they convert, you know, the garage conversion, and you know,
Right.
that's a pretty obvious illegality. But yeah, the old stuff.
I think you have to go, if in the spirit of where we're taking this, I think you've gotta give the benefit of the doubt that that's a legal but non-conforming
Right.
structure.
And are we okay with the language that if it's destroyed
Which one?
Yeah, that comes down.
at the end? Okay.
Well, I wanted to talk about that box, so, what box are we on?
Well, the fourth box is generally that you can continue a non-conforming use, or structure. And,
Yes.
and we're not gonna phase those out. Some cities, and Pasadena actually had this in some of our old code,
Yeah.
where at some point, you know, if somebody has the proverbial pig farm in downtown, you say, look, you get 10 years and then you gotta go. But we don't have any of those, and when we're not gonna go down that road.
Does ours include lots? You were saying that's not a huge
No, we
issue.
didn't.
So it's just structures and uses.
And then the next is demolition of non-conforming structure. If it's demolished voluntarily, is allowed to be reconstructed, and that we don't allow that. But what we do is, if it's involuntarily,
Yeah.
then it can be restored.
Okay. So should we talk about that section, or do
Yeah,
you
if
want to
there's
go through
any-
the matrix?
Yeah, I mean.
Go ahead.
Do you want to get into the wording, or do you
Probably
want
get into the weeds of it. So do you want to go through the matrix and then?
You think it's matrix first?
It's up to you guys. Which would you prefer? You have the matrix?
Well, I think we should go back and forth. So, like,
Then that's.
I know I had some notes on there, so
Okay.
then we can let's parse through that and then
Okay.
move
Okay.
on.
All right.
We're gonna go back and forth. I had questions
Okay.
that surfaced earlier.
Okay.
Just some general
Shoot,
questions.
yeah.
Yeah.
So if
Let's
I can
address
go
them.
back to those notes.
Yes.
I actually preferred the red line, so I will.
You're the computer guy, though.
Let me find my notes here. So it seemed like there were some inconsistencies on how we titled. So it's called a chapter, but then we refer to it as this title, which we changed from this zoning code.
Well, those are changes from the way Pasadena refers to their code versus to how we do.
So this, I'm sorry, I didn't understand that. You're saying this is a red line against
This is a
Pasadena.
red line
Correct.
against
We,
Pasadena.
ours was so bad that we
Okay.
took the
Move it out.
next closest thing we could live with, which was Pasadena's, and we are modifying that.
And
Okay.
then
We had to start with something.
our sort of standard way of doing this is we don't capitalize chapter, and whereas Pasadena does, and that's neither here nor there, but that's typically how we do it. So we just conform to our standard.
There were some terms in there that looked like they were defined terms, but they weren't capitalized, like director.
Yeah. In one of the things about, if you look at legal documents, often defined terms are all capitalized. We define terms and then use them without capitalizing them. So that's sort of the way it works. But the definition of director in the zoning code is the director of planning and community preservation, which used to be called the director of development services, which used to be called the director of planning
Yeah, and
officers.
the only way
So-
we know it changes is his sign changes, and that's
so
how we keep
they've-
up with
They've changed
it.
that title a few times, and so when you read through the code, you'll find sometimes people wrote in the title, and so what we're trying to do now is just use the word director so that when his title is changed again, we won't have to change the code.
Great.
Well, it can't get any longer anyway.
Oh, yeah.
But he'll have to get another plaque to put underneath.
Oh, yeah.
There was, just in the sake of uniformity, there was one or two definitions that were capitalized. Should we find those and?
Yeah, if there's, well, if there's something that doesn't string to you, let us know. Let's fix it.
Okay, I made a note of that somewhere, so I'll find that as we go. But those were kind of some of my overarching.
Yeah,
questions,
that's-
So I'm,
Yeah, that's how, and what we're doing now is we're trying to look at, we're using this comparison to try to look at the high points. Okay, what can we agree on and what we should proceed on? And we're going to have to chew on this and come back to it at least one more time. So, we're in the third meeting, I guess, on this issue. So it's, I think it even predates your arrival. So for some of us, it's, we've seen it.
sure,
Yeah.
I appreciate you
and-
taking a step back.
No, we need fresh eyes on it. We really do. And we need to be able to explain exactly how we got there. That's part of what our transparency is. So we want those questions.
And if you want to know the nitty-gritty of the sectioning, Pasadena maintains their zoning code separate than the rest of their municipal code. So their reference to zoning code is to their zoning code. Our zoning code is in Title 17. So if we reference this title, it means our zoning code.
That was one of my questions.
And if we talk about this chapter, that means in this instance it's 1756. Section, we're not consistent on whether we mean 1756 020 or subchapters. We don't use the term subchapters and items consistently. So sometimes somebody might refer to a part of one as a section or a subsection. And then code, this code means all Sierra Madre Municipal Code. And sometimes that's referred to as Sierra Madre Municipal Code or SMMC, or sometimes just this code.
That's very helpful. Thank you.
Isn't that usually explained in an administrative section up front somewhere?
Yeah, there's definition sections that talk about that and what the reference means.
It's outside of what we're dealing with.
Right.
Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah. I'd like to comment that I think that the matrix is really good, and if it's helpful for us, that when we get completely done with this, that some version of it for the public, for people who come in to see you would probably be very helpful too.
All right. Have we addressed your issues?
No.
Then let's do that.
I don't know if I saw this particular section in that matrix box, but 1756-060, abatement and termination. I think that might be part of that box, maybe not though. Okay. So I get how it's broken up into A and B, A being use, and I guess B is use too, but termination, violation of or change of use. Okay, so when any of the following things are found to exist, then it's cause for termination of that use or change of use. So I get 1, material violation of any applicable law. Okay. 2, a change from a non-conforming use to another non-conforming use. Okay. And 3 took me a second to think about, but it made total sense. A change from a non-conforming use to conforming use. Well, once you go to a conforming use, you
can't go back.
You abandon. So that makes sense. But 4, my note here said clarification on intent. So it's talking about, it seems like the stuff it's talking about as it gets into it is more related to non-conforming structure, not use. And so I'm trying to figure out like what the intent was to have, an increased enlargement of the area, space, or volume of the structure, which prior you define that in a non-conforming use you can't increase the size of it, the use, the area, space, or volume that it occupies or that's devoted to that use. But here it gets into things that are really about structural nonconformance, like setback, height, distance between projection, architectural stairs and landings, encroachments. It seems like that shouldn't be, because really what you're talking about is termination or violation in terms of use, in nonconforming use, right? Not structure. So I want to make sure we're keeping those separate, unless there's some other intent that I'm not quite getting.
Yeah. Well, I think generally that the concept is we allow certain changes and enlargements of non-conforming uses, but if you do that without following the rules, we're just going to say you can't continue your use. It's sort of a penalty. And maybe what we need to do here is include a provision that says except is allowed, by this chapter.
Code. Oh, it's allowed by this chapter.
Yeah.
I read that as that you can't expand an existing non-conforming
Use.
by any of these structural methods. In other words, if it's a business that is not, if it's not existing non-conforming, you can't make it into a bigger non-conforming business.
But I think
what it means to say. That's how I read it. So if you were to physically expand the structure that the non-conforming use is in, you still cannot expand your use
Right.
out further, even though there's more space in the structure.
okay, that's the first part, and then it says, okay, so what you just said is an increase or enlargement of the area, space, or volume of the structure, land occupied by or devoted to the non-conforming use. Okay, so that encompasses that, except if the structure is non-conforming with respect to these very specific things, setback, height, distance, encroachment, blah, 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 and other requirements of the city's adopted building code are met. So if you,
Yeah,
except if you meet those things, then it's okay to expand it, but at that point, it
yeah,
wouldn't be a
I think
non-conforming use.
you're right, Manish. I think because we do.
You should strike all that
we-
stuff after except.
We do in 1756-080E allow enlargement of non-conforming use in certain circumstances. So I think the thing to do is say, look, if you do it the way we say, then it's okay, but otherwise you lose it. And this was sort of Pasadena's version, and really I think we just read through this too quickly. And so what we should do is say, in 4, say, except as allowed in this chapter, an increase, blah, 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 and then put a period after use, and everything here where it says, except if blah, blah, blah,
Yeah.
just strike that.
I think so, because you mentioned it again later, and so,
Yeah.
okay, so that's good. And then 5, a structural alteration except as required by law, okay.
So just, before we move on, so I got it right, under number 4, so a comma after non-conforming use, except as allowed by this chapter. Did I get that right?
Well, I would just
I
say,
think,
except as allowed by this chapter, comma, an increase or enlargement area, space, or volume of the structure or land occupied by or devoted to the non-conforming use, period.
Period.
And then,
Period, okay.
but I think,
Everything
You could add, no new additions or alterations shall increase existing nonconformities?
Oh, well, I think that first sentence is good. I think everything after use, except, that should all go away.
Mm-hmm.
I think what we should do is say, we should start off, except as allowed by this chapter, comma, and then put
Yes.
1, an increase, blah, 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 and then put a 2, no new additions or alterations shall increase existing nonconformance.
Oh, yeah, okay.
Okay, I'm all right with that. 2, okay.
Yeah, that's a good catch.
And or there is basically, you trigger any one of these 5 and
Right.
you're out.
Right, it's in any of them.
A structural alteration except as required by law. The only thing with that, I mean, I guess that's fine. I think what you mean is like a seismic retrofit or something like a structural,
Yeah, like a URM.
but that's required by code law. Like when is it required by law? Like
Well,
you don't
code
have
is
to
law.
upgrade.
Code is
Is
law.
that what you mean here?
Well, there's another section that's dedicated to the retrofit.
No, I understand, but I'm just saying a structural alteration except as required by law.
Law is
I-
the larger term. If we use the word law, it means our code.
Anything.
State law,
Okay.
federal law,
Yeah,
whatever.
and it's the kind of thing where you don't want to,
Okay.
you
Not
don't
do
want to
it.
preclude some future
Yeah.
law or,
Okay. Got it. All right, so the next one was in B that I put the same note, clarification on intent. So B is termination of non-conforming uses by discontinuance. Okay, so 1's fine. 2, a non-conforming use within a structure shall also lose its non-conforming status if the structure is moved any distance on the site for any reason or is removed from the site.
right.
So explain that. What's the intent of that?
Well, that's if you demo the structure, and moving it is, I mean, you could do that, that's the easy way, but it's, you know.
That one seemed weird, just
Would
like,
it be like a non-conforming sign? If you had a sign up front that was non-conforming and then you wanted
Yeah,
to
you
move
might
it?
move
well, I don't know if, I could see that, but in structures, is that inclusive of?
I mean, if you
To
want to
me,
be more
structures
clear
is
of it, I mean, this
habitable,
is
a
really the
building or a
part.
house or, I mean, it's just, I don't know unless we define it.
Well, if you have a
Signage.
structure in town that's selling hamburgers and it isn't licensed to sell, or it isn't, it's a pre-existing non-conforming, and the guy wants to move it across the street because he brought another lot,
Yeah, I don't know.
He
I don't
can't-
know
he
why
can't do that
Physically
because it-
moving the structure?
yeah.
It's,
people move
I think
houses.
really the general point of this
Yeah.
is if you demolish it voluntarily, you don't get to build it back. But Pasadena must have had some issue with people moving things.
Like
And,
an
so
ice
that-
cream truck kind of thing or something? Like, I mean, I'm trying to figure out, it just seemed weird, that's all. Like odd, I guess, not weird.
I don't know.
Now, Pasadena does move things. They have been known to move historic residential structures and to make way for a new project, for instance. They will always prefer that the structure be moved rather than demolished, with a priority of moving it within the city of Pasadena,
But
than moving it outside afterwards.
This
They
section
do
is-
this. They've done this a number of times, and so it would.
This
be
one
more
even
important
says
for
if the
them.
structure is moved any distance on the site for any reason, so to me, it's like if we move something 10 feet,
So you
so
want
it's
to,
like a mobile, like hamburger station.
The structure's destroyed by a casualty event, and you want to rebuild it, but you want to site it differently, if you want to be that stern.
See, that
But
doesn't,
I would interpret this to mean,
what if
as
it's,
an example,
Vo-
you would lose your non-conforming.
if you voluntarily destroyed it?
Well, if you voluntarily destroy it, it's gone.
Yeah.
But let's say it burns down because it's struck by lightning, we would let you rebuild that. But the way I read this, if you wanted to relocate it on the same site, you're gonna lose the non-conformity. If you wanna do that, we're gonna make you comply with today's zoning code, today's,
I think
square
there also
footage.
might be issues with, if you have a non-conforming use in a building that's very close to the road, and then the road is widened, and then you move it back, you don't get to do that. And so maybe that's what's driving some of this. I mean, one of the things we could do is just say, it says if the structure is demolished,
Okay.
and then leave this other language in just in case, I don't know. Because the main thing we're concerned here is if someone voluntarily demolishes their property, they lose their rights
Yeah,
to the non.
that's a given, yeah.
And so we're sort of getting to it by going a roundabout way,
Well,
and it might be better just say it.
Yeah, I agree. And I think you could, I mean, if you want to leave their stuff, just if the structure is moved or is removed or demolished, I guess we're going to say, from the site.
I think
Forget
it
the
could
stuff
come,
about any distance, like what,
we have structures on lots where there's room for two structures if you could move one of them. And so, you take that little house that's in the middle of the lot, you push it to the back, you could build another one in front. I mean, that wouldn't be so hard.
okay, well, but in that example, why wouldn't we allow that?
Maybe for
So
some,
if we're preventing that, I don't like that.
okay.
Yeah.
But I mean, I think it's in the commercial example that this has more applicability. I think.
Okay, then he
Well, I
moved it,
think.
they moved
I don't know.
the structure to put in a parking lot so they could, up their business.
Well, but it could also be.
No, because they should have relief for parking.
Yeah, or what if there's also.
Nice try.
I mean, what if there's a building where someone wants to move it forward to comply with setbacks, and they're saying, well, I want to move the same structure and have the same square footage, but I'm gonna comply with the setbacks, I'm gonna move it forward, like a
Make it
granny,
less less.
a granny flat in the back that they're saying, I wanna, bring it up to code, but I'm willing to bring it forward to make the,
Well,
existing, to meet
I
the
don't know,
setback.
the problem with this is you sort of torture yourself trying to figure out
Well,
examples.
this is for uses, though. That's the thing.
This is for uses.
That's we have to be careful.
And, I think the concept really goes down to the idea that we've grown accustomed to the way it is. And as long as you don't mess with it, we're okay. And so, I don't know,
Well,
the sneaky things that somebody could do by moving, but
No, that's not, well, to me, I'm totally with you on that. But what happens is when this stuff gets codified in here, and years down the road, like the applicability of when you're at the counter trying to figure out, can I do this, can I not, and you get something here that's ambiguous or loose or it.
So what would you
Well,
propose?
to me, reading this section, it almost didn't belong unless it's what John's saying. It's really like if you remove the structure or demolish it, you're done. You can't,
Okay,
it's discontinued, that use, basically.
so
that's
non-conforming
what it
use
should
within a
say.
structure shall lose its non-conforming if the structure is moved.
Removed. Moving,
what-
I think, is irrelevant. What's the moving, that part? I didn't get that.
I don't know.
I mean-
I can't imagine this has been a big issue for us, so I don't care if it stays in or goes, really.
Because this section B is about termination of non-conforming uses by discontinuance. So any instance that constitutes a discontinuance, that's what we're talking about.
Okay,
right?
I think
Why
you're
don't
on
we
it.
just say, a non-conforming use within a structure shall also lose its non-conforming status if the structure is demolished or removed from the site. And don't worry about the moving, because I don't
doesn't make any
think
Okay.
moving is a big issue.
Okay,
Perfect. That makes sense.
everybody else all right with that?
That's fine.
Okay,
All right.
what else you got?
I'm on 175670, I guess. So, yeah.
17,
This was,
The other stuff's down
56070.
I wanted to understand more about what the idea was here. If this was let people rebuild to their non-conforming previous status in the event of,
Yeah, and this goes to the next box, which is, one is maintenance, which I
Okay.
don't think anyone has an issue with generally. We can look at the wording. But then the issue is if the property is demolished involuntarily through a casualty or whatnot, do we let them rebuild? And the general thought in our discussion was that we want to let people rebuild. And this is where the redlining goes crazy, because Pasadena had these in different areas and we brought them together. But, so that's sort of the general concept, and,
rebuild to what? To where they were before the casualty event? So if they're completely non-conforming,
Well,
get struck by lightning,
yeah. I mean,
then they can rebuild to that completely non-conforming.
Think use as opposed to structure.
well, they're both.
I
We're
mean,
talking about
we
both.
wouldn't let them rebuild a non-conforming structure in terms of building code,
No,
but they
zoning
could,
code.
but they could restore to the zoning code. Does that make sense?
right. So what the replacement is, and this is in 1756-070B1B, the replacement structure matches the original structure in terms of exterior materials, height, setback, size, and building configuration. But then in C, the replacement structure is in compliance with the city's adopted building code. So that,
was very, I don't understand how you
It's because the
reconcile
building code under C is a different ordinance than.
right, the
than
building
the
code.
zoning that's described above in B.
Yeah.
Right. The building code is how you put
How you
the
put it
house together.
together,
The safety elements involved. Construction standards, thank you. B goes into more zoning issues about what setbacks are like, height. And so we're saying, we're gonna let you build a house that looks pretty much the same. It's in the same area, but the guts of it, you gotta bring up to current code. So if you had old wiring and, faulty foundation and all that kind of stuff, sure. And then you've got bad setbacks for current code, you can build it with your non-conforming setbacks. But you gotta bring it up to code, because why wouldn't you?
Okay, so then if I have a shake roof, it says in B that I have to keep the same exterior materials.
Yeah, but you
Well,
can have
but we got-
see, it's the fireman and you,
Read
it's,
that also, though, because B is
know what
for
you're saying.
non-residential uses and structures. So these are commercial buildings, like B, because C is about residential uses and structures. So we got to separate the two, because the language is different between the two. Like if
Right.
you read in B, that's exactly where you're reading,
Yep.
like materials, but that's not related to your house. It's related to this structure or any of the storefronts downtown.
but
Or
what I think you're getting at is the fireman in you is looking at, okay, what's that safety margin? And you can buy shakes that are Class A rated. So while it used to be a wooden product, now it's a,
Fiberglass or whatever.
fiberglass or whatever.
And C would trump what if you read in B, the materials, they'll say it was wood shake on the front part of the building, commercial building, like a Pizza Hut roof, C would trump that in an instant. Yeah, you can have shake, but it's gotta be a Class A rated material, because you're in the fire zone that you're in, or,
Okay.
you know, or 1 hour rated, or whatever it needs to be.
Someone once explained to me is you can probably, and correct me if I'm wrong, you can have the same footprint, but it has to be built to current standards.
Construction standards, that's right.
Right.
So it may be placed on the lot not in compliance with existing setbacks and things like that, because it's always been there, but it must comply with building code, current UBC.
Do we have elsewhere in our, just broadly, in our regulations, do we have anything about a percentage of rebuilding? That it says that if you're below a certain threshold, you're allowed to do so on and so forth. But if by cost or percentage of rebuilding that you're exceeding this threshold, that then you're required to have full compliance. I'm concerned here that we may be like lapsing over with any other regulations like that might exist in the building code.
I think the building code defines certain thresholds.
Does, yeah. We anytime you're constructing something new or replacing, the building code will answer those kinds of questions. If you're tying into existing plumbing or existing wiring because it wasn't completely damaged, the building code will tell you how you have to do it now. And so I don't think we have to get that specific in the ordinance. In terms of percentages, I will tell you that the city's old ordinance used to make a distinction between destruction of a residential use by casualty, and even if it was 100% destroyed, you could rebuild it. But if it was not a residential use, a non-residential use, then you could only rebuild it if only a certain percentage was restored. And if destroyed. And if 100% was gone, well, too bad for you, because we don't like non-conforming uses, but we do care about your house. And so those are just different examples of different approaches. It's all up to your policy decision. There's no one right way.
Yeah, well, there are some people that will refer to a 100% repair with a straight face. Okay,
Right.
but I'm primarily concerned that we tease this out so that we do not, and I don't have the answer on the tip of my tongue, but that we tease this out so that we have a clean distinction, and we're not saying something here that might be found to be somewhat in conflict, at least operationally, for you all at the counter.
Keep in mind, these are involuntary, and one of the items in B1A is the applicant provides documentation satisfactory to the director supporting the claim that the damage or destruction occurred involuntarily. So it's not the case where they're going to be doing the rehab and say, oh, I did the rehab here, which is a voluntary thing. So I think you're going to have a distinction in this versus the place where people are doing the rehab and then try to sneak in and use this code as opposed to the normal code.
I'm really not.
If we go to the next box, on the next page, we may address some of that. Changes to non-conforming structures.
Where are we on the box? Because
We're in the first box on the second page.
I think you might have passed me.
080. Did we pass you?
Okay.
I want to stay on the last box of the first page, which
Okay.
is involuntary destruction, and then sort of the 1756-070.
070, got it.
Right.
And what I'd like to do, if possible, I have a bunch of notes on C,
Mm-hmm.
which is the residential portion, but I think it could apply to the non.
Okay.
But
Okay.
we can go through C and then see if, because they are slightly different, B
They
and
are.
C, and I
C-
want to see if there's any reason for that, but C is probably the bigger one for structures.
Right. Well, C
So-
is a little bit more flexible than
So-
the non-res, and
Okay.
that's
So I want to go through C.
and that's basically just taken over from Pasadena code.
Okay.
And if we don't like that, we want to make it equal, then we can.
Well, I want to see the merits of that, but first I want to go through C and see if
Mhm.
some of this I have some questions and then sort of how we.
Go ahead.
So you get to C, residential uses or structures, C1. Non-conforming single multifamily dwelling, okay, that makes sense, including residential components in the mixed use that have been involuntarily damaged or destroyed by a catastrophic event. So my first note was, are these two conditions or a series of conditions? In other words, you fall in either one of those two camps, like it's either involuntarily damaged or it's destroyed by a specific event, like, fire, hurricane, flood, et cetera, or are we trying to say non-conforming single multifamily dwelling units that have been involuntarily damaged, comma, destroyed by a catastrophic event or other casualty? I only brought in that language of other casualty because when we get into lists, we always run, like this list, for example, I think it's pulled straight from Pasadena. On a catastrophic event, it says fire or other calamity by act of God. Okay, we understand that. Or by the public enemy. And so I was on Webster's, Merriam, trying to figure out this.
Left over from World War II.
Yeah, so and I even asked my wife, I'm like, what? Like, how does this apply? And the closest thing I could think of was like in an act of war or something,
right,
where something is destroyed or a terrorist attack,
Terrorism.
and your house,
Right.
catches friendly fire and it's destroyed, and so in that case, but so then I'm like, okay, that's very specific, and it just didn't make sense. Like, so when we get into lists, I know we're always saying it's not limited to this. This is just an example. But I hate when we do that, only because sometimes it's followed to the letter of that law of what's written, and so it traps us.
Is this something the city attorney would like to, is there a more common language that it deals with the causes for obliteration of a structure?
A catastrophic event.
I'm troubled by it because it's involuntarily damaged can mean just about anything. It could mean termite infestation.
Okay.
Right.
Unless you don't want it to, but that's
No.
what it could mean.
And with respect to that, could we add deterioration, natural deterioration, or something to the
Dry rot, stuff, that's
Yeah.
Well,
or
just
maintenance
Should
issue.
we
time and
add-
age in the sense of, there are some
Right.
very old structures that were built fine for their time period, but Gina had brought this up when we
Yeah.
first started discussing. It's like, well, that's the fault, potentially. I'm paraphrasing. I could be wrong, so I apologize, Gina. But that it could be, you didn't maintain it, all the owners, and so that's kind of their issue. But some of these structures, like from 1904, 1905, 1908, like it's not the fault of maintenance. It's just the dry rot, the deterioration,
Yeah, you couldn't see it.
So
that's covered though.
that's why you have the two categories.
Okay.
Involuntarily damaged doesn't just mean the casualty event.
Okay,
A casualty event can be
very
you know,
specific.
even though it's not listed, it could be,
Earthquake.
someone misses the turn and plows their car into
Yes.
the front of your house.
Okay.
But that is a casualty event, even though it's not listed in the EG4 example.
Mm-hmm. And we also have, and this is interesting, the first letter A is that the applicant provides documentation satisfactory to the director supporting the claim that damage or destruction occurred involuntarily. And interestingly, Pasadena didn't have that in both. They only had it in one, and we're like, well, why wouldn't you want this for both? So,
Well, so back to C1. So the understanding is these are two separate conditions. One sort of is not a specific event or action. It could cover a lot.
Involuntarily damaged, it may not
Or-
be completely destroyed.
Okay, or destroyed by a catastrophic event.
Right, one's clearly a casualty event.
Okay.
And, insect damage, dry rot, doesn't necessarily qualify as that. So I think that's my sense, and
Okay.
that is how we have read aspects of our old code before. We had some similar language, as bad as it was. And in a situation where a property or a structure was replaced due to extensive termite damage and it was non-conforming, we interpreted it that way to allow it to be rebuilt.
So
Okay.
you're reading termite damage to be involuntary,
Involuntary
but not
damage.
catastrophic?
Well, it may or may not be. I guess if you let it go long enough, it will.
Because I guess,
eventually become.
so Manish, if I'm understanding you, you're saying we've got these two terms, damaged or destroyed, right? And you want to know if involuntary applies to both or just one, and you want to know if catastrophic event applies to both or just one, right?
Yeah, well, what I'm trying to be very clear in the language is it a series, like if any of these type of things happen, and really you only have two. One is involuntarily damaged, and because the or is right after that, that says, or destroyed by catastrophic event, which is a very specific, you know.
Oh, see, that's not how I read it. I read
There are
it,
two things. If any of these two, if one of these two apply to your property, then you're good.
Yeah, see,
And that's
You-
considered.
I read it
seeing as damaged or
involuntarily
destroyed.
damaged or destroyed.
See,
In
so it's
either
one.
event by catastrophic
one
event.
thing.
Right.
It's one thing.
See, I
And-
see it
and
as two things.
damaged or destroyed is
Ah.
just an extent issue. Because destroyed means completely,
yeah.
damaged means partially.
So then, in that scenario, they're not allowing for the
The termites and the dry rot.
long-term
Mhm.
deterioration
That's
that's
why I was
not
saying.
caused by a catastrophic event, which
Right,
then I
and
don't.
that was-
then that
That's
And
why I
that was
said
one
maybe
of the
we should add it.
discussions we had with Gina about the deferred maintenance and letting it go kind of issue.
Because you cannot say really that neglect is totally involuntary.
no, but yeah, I agree with that. But what I'm saying is there is
Yeah, but termites, are you saying termites are voluntary?
Well, we
No,
we
but
all
there
have
are-
to, we all have to keep that stuff up and
Termites are a result of
maintain
neglect is
periodically.
what is the implication.
Right.
yeah. See, I.
Well,
I,
you see, we're gonna get into a lot of gray areas. I think are gonna be an
Well,
awful
well,
lot
this
of
is-
arguments in
See
practice.
that sort of approach goes squarely against this idea of being flexible and wanting to allow, maintain, but to current code, sort of non-conforming structures. Like now we're becoming very like, if it didn't happen because of a catastrophic event, which we can include termite and decay and all that, then you can't replace
We're not being
that
as
structure.
permissive.
We can't replace that structure.
Well, I guess one of the things is, a lot of times when you hear about the deferred maintenance, you think about sort of structures that are there and that, the evil developer is letting it go, and so we're not going to let
Demolition
him.
by neglect.
Right, but typically in that scenario, that person doesn't want to recreate a non-conforming use. They want to build something big and new, right?
And replace
so,
it.
And so, in a lot of ways, the person who's really going to get trapped up in your sort of deferred maintenance neglect is the person who's just sort of a careless homeowner or not on top of it, and they go, oh my God, I didn't realize these termites have eaten away my house.
But some of it also is like we have structures that are over 100-year-old, and they're not necessarily the hugest structures. Could be a second unit or it could be the primary unit, small houses, and we're saying, the current owner who may not be neglecting the property, but there have been 90+ years of previous ownership who this might have happened, didn't get the termite, this or that. And so now we're saying you can't replace or rebuild or whatever the case may be under this non-conforming use because we're saying too bad, it wasn't maintained.
Well, maybe we should just like let that whole thing go, and not try to make too much of a distinction. Because I think the real distinction here, listening to everybody talking a few minutes ago, was do you just want your little old bungalow? Do you really want to just rebuild it because you need to recreate it because of some kind of damage, and it's been there for 80 years, and nobody's ever had a problem with the little bungalow. So what's wrong with that? The real distinction is when the bungalow wants to get knocked down to build a very, very large new house, and that's where you step completely out of this and go to the new zoning, right?
Right.
Yeah, but
right.
there's
And-
some.
Maybe
there's,
we should just
there's
leave it
some-
cleanly like
yeah,
that.
And I think there's some caveats in here that prevent that from happening because, we're gonna say, okay, it's involuntarily damaged. Go ahead and rebuild, move, whatever, but it's gonna have to be the same size,
Right.
Right,
same footprint.
right, because
these
we've grown
things.
used to the way it
Yeah.
is, yes.
So I think we're okay in that regard. Like if that was the case, I think you're not gonna wanna go through this. You're gonna wanna,
So I guess the issue then, from forgetting the language parsing, on a policy perspective, do we want to say involuntary just means catastrophic event? Or do we?
no, I think
do
you
we
can
wanna
read
say-
this the other way,
No,
which.
I don't say how we can read this, because we can fix this to
Okay.
say however we want. I think more importantly is, what do we want?
I think we want both.
We want both.
We want the one-time event, like the truck backs into your house or your accessory structure, or.
Or
you
your
know, it's
elderly
flooded.
mother has neglected the house because she can't afford to fix it for 20 years.
Sure.
And you inherit it and want to keep it or return it to where it
Sure.
was.
So, and that's involuntarily damaged to me, which is more it's not a specific event that triggered this, but it's something that's happened from termites to,
Yeah.
those kind of things. But it's also the catastrophic event. So I think it's
Well, right.
two things.
I think everyone agrees the catastrophic. I'm sort of trying to, wonder if the involuntary neglect is a big enough loophole to, sort of,
Encompass all those.
yeah.
Well,
but
in
then-
in the previous, like the version, and I don't know if this is any better, but our previous code,
Oof.
yeah, I know, it says, it had fire explosion, I don't know, but it said other casualty or act of God or the public enemy, but other casualty was the terminology for involuntarily damaged. That's what we had.
Well, yeah,
but-
we've got that fire or other calamity,
Yeah, but
casualty.
that was interpreted to mean kind of the decay, time and age, structural deficiencies or pests,
Or you could add
I don't know how you-
irreparably deteriorated, so that if it's to your interest, but that does happen a lot. That is something that comes to us often, is things that are falling apart and I want to, be able to reconstruct. I can't fix it, or I have to demo half of it because that part is so damaged. We do get that.
Yeah, I
So
would think that happens a lot on,
Older houses.
and also sort of not main structures, but outbuildings or fences that aren't really built to last, and so somebody builds the fence where we wouldn't allow them now, and the wood starts to rot, and they say, I want to build it back, and I guess it's sort of like, do you want to continue to let somebody replace a thing that sort of has a short lifespan inherently, that we would want them now to move?
Well, but see, to me, like, I think if we're encouraging this, this really gets down to the heart of, like, I think it's all those things you mentioned, but it's also structures. It's homes.
Mhm.
It's maybe
I agree,
second
it's homes.
Garage.
But, garages, habitable structures where, I want to allow you to rebuild that structure,
The
but
way it was.
the way it was, and maybe even where it was, but to current code,
It's a
like,
form of
why wouldn't
community
we?
preservation.
As opposed to, okay, well then, if you're not gonna let me, I'm gonna demolish it, fine, I lose that non-conforming use, but then I'm gonna come back and, build something bigger on the entire property, I mean, I think it does trickle down to this idea of, we want more smaller units, and adaptive, it's not reuse, but
Existing,
preservation of that
preservation
sort
of existing structures.
Yeah, I think I agree with you.
Yeah, I'm okay with that.
So, is it staff and council's understanding that the current language encompasses that kind of thought, or do you think we need to be more clear that it's not just a casualty event?
Given the discussion we've had and you know, there are two ways to look at the language that's on the page. I think we should clarify it.
Yeah.
I
Good.
kind of like Leticia's phrase of adding irreparably deteriorated. And we could even give some examples, you know, from insect or dry rot or age.
Is there any way to, and this may be totally not appropriate, but if we had like a term like involuntarily damaged, and with just those two words, we're meaning sort of all of those, encompassing those, you know, deterioration factors. Can we define that?
Yeah, we
Like,
could do that.
Yeah, there's a
Like,
definite, yeah.
by this we mean, you know, the termite dry rot, the time and age deterioration.
maintenance.
Lack of maintenance, you know, because I think what's gonna happen, well, if we can down further, there may be a stopgap where the city will have to sort of take a peek at that. You know, like if I come to the counter and say my structure is involuntarily damaged, you know, and so therefore I want to do X, Y, and Z, I don't think we should just like say, okay, well, fine, go ahead, you know.
We need
I
to
think
ins-
there's gonna
you
be-
want to inspect.
Exactly. So I think someone's gonna deem that property meets that criteria.
I think that the problem with then defining involuntarily damaged as only the termite and all of that is that you take away the interpretation that you had of that sentence, which means that the catastrophic event can completely destroy something or just damage something, and you
Well, we
should be
can-
able
Well,
to rebuild.
Yeah, I think that's
damaged or
fixable.
destroyed.
But I do think that, I think
More
there's a good point here that you've got sort of adjectives coming from either direction, and it creates ambiguity. And the right answer is to take that out, make it clear somewhere else.
Yeah.
And then just use the defined term. And it repeats in both sections, in the non-res and the res.
And you could do the same for if you want to do catastrophic event and then just
Make a list.
Make a list, but say similar.
But we
type
don't
of-
use those
I don't know.
concepts separately. We always put them together. So I think the defined term should just include both.
Okay.
And I think that's pretty easy to
Okay.
do. I can do that.
Okay.
Do we define the public enemy?
I just
North Korean missiles or something?
You can get in some dicey political issues if we start
okay.
saying who the public.
We'll
enemy
pass
is.
that.
Yeah.
So, John, you are going to revise this language, is that the
Yeah,
way
I
this
do
works?
that.
Okay.
Okay, so that answered my question there. Okay, so then in that same C1, after we get past the catastrophic event, may be repaired, reconstructed, or replaced perfect with the new structure using the same development standards applied to the damaged or destroyed structures, e.g. setbacks, square footage, building height, and density standards. Should only be, so all of those sort of factors or items there listed have a very specific effect on that reconstruction or
Mhm.
whatever. And some I think are more applicable in the sense of wanting to maintain what you previously had.
Right.
And others actually, I think, make it more difficult or should refer back to the current code we have and not, so the way I kind of see it is like setbacks is a huge one, yards and setbacks. That's like, we should allow them to maintain the non-conforming if
Right.
that's something that's preventing, you know,
Well,
reconstruction.
if they have a
Square
footprint on,
footage,
if
the
they have a
footprint.
footprint on a lot, whether it's too close to, wherever it is in terms of setbacks, they get that footprint,
Yeah, that I agree.
okay?
But I think like building height, for example, when you talk about very old structures and then you're saying you can have the non-conforming use and structure, but you're gonna build it to current code, things are much bigger, you know, in terms of size. Like the height, I think that should refer back to, you've gotta meet the current zone as opposed
For
to.
height only?
Yeah, because to me, that's not about footprint or area or where it is on
But
the
it's-
property.
But it's still massing of what we, in other words, it's what we're used to in terms of how big this structure is.
Yeah, but that structure might have been that size based on, let's say the previous code, who knows when, said no structures could be built higher than 15 feet tall or something, right? But the current code says in that zone, let's say R1, let's just pick R1. And you have a second house, or the primary house, for example, is non-conforming.
Right.
And we're saying you can build, I think we changed that, I'm not sure, but it's 25 feet to a third of the
Right, but
roof height.
didn't measure, but in the history of our building code, we've been more restrictive as to height over time as opposed to less restrictive.
But they can.
Because Measure Y came in and we can't build it more than a certain height. I mean, before then, it was that goofy formula of in the middle of the slope on the whatever that you had to go to advanced math for.
But I think if current code allows a higher height, you could do your nonconformance and then go to the higher height.
No, you
I
can't.
would caution against that. The whole thing about replacing a non-conforming structure or use, we shouldn't, well, I mean, you can, it's a policy call. But it would be very unusual to allow people to pick and choose the things I'm gonna take my smaller setbacks and my larger square footage than I could get today. But gee whiz, my house wasn't as tall as it could be today. So I'm gonna keep everything I like about the nonconformity, and I'm gonna take advantage of the new rules. And the whole, you don't really get to mix that normally.
No, we've seen some problems in the past when people have tried to do that sort of thing.
Well, but
Different
You're
regs.
expanding the nonconformity. When you let someone build it taller, because today they could, but if they were also going to comply with today's code, they wouldn't get they wouldn't get that same footprint, because now you're too much into the setbacks and we can't let you do that. Maybe the house is the square footage is larger than what it would be today if you built it today as a new structure, because we changed that. So you let them recreate the footprint, but now you're going to let them be bigger. You are essentially expanding the nonconformity, and that's why it's not generally done. However, it's a policy call. You could choose to do it.
see, I think all of those tools or mechanisms affect the nonconformity to different degrees. So like, if you have a property right on the side setback, let's say, right? That has a much greater effect on your neighbor, let's say rebuilding it, because non-conforming, you can put it right back there where you want. I mean, there's property issues, there's fire issues.
But it's been there since, the city has grown up around it. It's been there for X number of time. I'm not in favor of giving somebody an advantage, but if they've got that little bungalow it's been designed by some architect with some massing, and they want to keep it looking the same way, then I believe height is part of that replication. Whereas if suddenly they come back with that little bungalow and it's now 5 feet taller, I think the public will notice that, and they will perceive that as a advantage as opposed to a replication.
Right. And what I was saying before about the greater height, if the code allows it, I mean in the part that's compliant. So if you had a part that is non-conforming because it invades the setback, I wouldn't want to see someone make that part higher. But
this only applies to non-conforming.
Right, but I mean, to the extent that they have the house has portions that are conforming, right? And this is when we get into the section of alterations. That portion can go to the current zoning because it's within the conforming portion. But the non-conforming portion, I wouldn't want to see a height that was 12 feet go to 15 feet or 20 feet just because we can in current code.
It's enough of a challenge. It's enough of a challenge to get most people to provide good plans that are a very, very accurate replication of what was there before. It can be done. The only time really that it can't be done is if there's something so incredibly catastrophic? I mean, when do you really see like 100% demolition of vaporization of a building to the point where we have absolutely nothing that we can go back and work with? Okay, you're giving people certain benefit here. You're allowing them this one option if they want to do it, and so just cleanly say, if you're going to rebuild it to the same volume, the same footprint, the same shape, everything. I mean, it's a community preservation thing to say you have the option to just put it back the way it was, okay? Like before the airplane crashed into it, you get to put it back the way it was. That's a good thing to be able to do for people, okay? Otherwise you're potentially saddling somebody with what if they can't afford to comply with new zoning? You know, they're old people with limited resources, and you're suddenly it's enough just to let them put it back the way it was. The only thing I'm worried about is if there was a bootleg condition, not that something is old, but we've seen things where somebody really bootlegs with a setback, and we don't want them to. That's going to be an odd condition. We don't want them to be able to build back the bootleg portion at all. But I really think that it's going to be enough administratively, and it will also be fairly kind to people if we can say we'll let you build it back just the way it was before the airplane hit it, and that's that. Otherwise you're into new zoning requirements.
Well, I mean, I'm also referring. Okay, so in that case, I get that argument for the volume. I guess I'm also sort of advocating for instances where, to me, there's a little bit of a conflict with building code in the sense of you could have a very old structure where the roof structure is built out of 2x3s, and it's this thick, and the ceiling height in there's sub 80 inches.
And we're going to go to 4x4s like we did.
Well, no, but it's not a historical structure, so you don't,
Right.
Like, what I'm trying to say is there has to be some latitude where you're putting the structure back, but you're putting it back as square footage I totally get, okay? Footprint I totally get.
Okay.
Setbacks,
Okay.
that's one where I think the nonconformance can be hard, but that's fine. I don't have any problems
Right.
with that.
That's where it was. That's where the old one was
Volume
anyway.
I have some issues with because suddenly,
So
and I'm not advocating for like allowing them to, if the current code says you can build to 25 feet, but the structure was only 15 feet tall, that they should be able to raise it 10 feet. What I'm saying is there has to be some latitude where because of current code, it's going to allow the ceiling, for example, the roof, for example.
So
to be
volume-
at least 12 inches.
okay. So volume precludes massing.
Or you put a pitch on it. That's
But if you put a pitch on it, then you didn't build it back to the way it was.
Well, but it's possible, and I've seen this condition where it has the roof actually, because of deterioration and such, is actually sagging in reverse, or there was a lean-to built and now the structure is starting to, these are very in the weeds, but my point being is like,
So we're talking about a small percentage difference.
Okay, but
very small.
but
I want it to be clear that that goes to the spirit of the flexibility. I'm not saying no one wants to see a 25-foot tall building at your property line with your neighbor, and it's a non-conforming use that you've been allowed to rebuild. I get that. That's the one extreme.
Right.
But the other extreme is like if we're dotting I's and crossing T's on, the structure was 12 and a half feet tall, but that house or that one-bedroom shack or whatever it was had 80-inch or 79-inch ceilings inside the space, and
So-
it's built with 2x3s.
So what's our solution?
I think you got to
Don't-
be close. You know what I'm saying? Or
I think I think
I don't know how we language it.
there's there's some inherent flexibility that I think staff is gonna allow
Okay.
if it's really minor, you know. But the other thing is in the section where we deal with alterations and additions to non-conforming uses and structures, 1756-080C, we talk about seismic retrofitting and building code compliance. And so, you know, I think that the things that you're talking about there really are things that we want to talk about when we get to that thing, because if you have the right to tear a part of it down and change it a little bit to get to code compliance, well then if it's involuntarily destroyed, you'd have that same right to change it a little bit for this other code. So I think
If that's the understanding, then that's fine. I'm totally with that.
Should that be in definition?
Well, I mean, either way, you have to, one of the requirements is that you have to be in compliance to the building code that's applicable now.
Yeah.
It's too hard to keep copies of, some cities do it, of other building codes that existed 10 years ago, 20 years ago, so that you can, see if it was legal then. So, because you have to comply with today's building code, and today's building code says ceilings need to be this high,
Which it does.
which it does,
Oh.
and that means you gotta, raise the roof a little. I think that staff would consider that substantial compliance with the requirements, and that today's building code is going to trump that.
So,
Yeah, where you get, where, my house is 1947, 1950, and all of the roof rafters are 2x12s, okay, big deal. That hasn't changed that much. But to your point, where this is going to require some parsing, perhaps on the part of staff, is going to be like with canyon structures. There are places in the canyon, and some of them fit very, very nicely. A lot of them fit very, very nicely into their neighborhood. You'd say yes, letting you rebuild the way it was is a matter of community preservation. But to your point, there may be 7'4" ceilings, and then there's just 2x3 rafters on top of it. Of course, you've got to come up.
So if
somewhat.
that flex latitude is built into this,
It's built in.
Well,
Okay.
let's-
Say you have to
Well,
comply.
Let's look when we get to 1756-080. Let's look at the language there, because to me, if you read these two together, when you're rebuilding, you would have the right to do this alteration. So you would have that alteration as you're rebuilding, and that would work. And that's a different issue than somebody who's got, the 12-foot and wants to go to 20-foot just because they like
all
it
right.
better.
So so let's pin that till we get to the next section. But in D, so this is subsection C1D, a building permit, so it says, a building permit is issued within 24 months after the date of destruction, and the construction is diligently pursued to completion. This all is fine and dandy when you can define the date of destruction like a catastrophic event, but in that involuntarily damaged, that could have started happening, or 25 years ago. You can't define that date, right? So it's one of those. It doesn't match with.
Well, isn't the
the
date
trigger.
Isn't the date there in that case when it's determined to be irreparably deteriorated?
Well, I think what this should be tied to is the date the applicant provides that documentation, meaning, because you're going to provide some sort of documentation, which is another issue. I don't know, is that fancy language for basically if it's involuntarily damaged or a catastrophic event, like a structural report, or what is the documentation like?
Yeah, but the problem you get is, somebody goes to the library and digs up the historic archives and says, look, and coupled with the newspaper article about how the house burnt down in 1912, and I'm providing you the materials just today.
Well, that's part of the what is in C1A, what is that documentation that's satisfactory to the director supporting the claim that the damage or destruction occurred involuntarily?
Well, isn't, the applicant is coming to the counter looking to rebuild. And so we're asking the applicant saying, yeah, and maintaining nonconformance. And so at that point, I guess the next question, staff needs to chime in here, well,
What do you ask for?
you're gonna ask for proof, and then that starts this timeline. Before then, they didn't need to rebuild it because no one asked to do it.
Yeah, all you have to say is from the date of determination, because if there's a very bad fire in the place, I think the determination is going to be made that night by the fire
Well,
department.
that's different, though. What I'm getting at
He's
is
talking about the termites.
I'm talking about the long-term deterioration. You can't establish a date because it might have started happening 25 years ago. I mean, how do you establish a date?
I think what's getting either after the date of destruction, or maybe the date of what is that date?
I think it needs to tie back into A somehow, saying when that documentation's provided to the satisfaction of the director, that gets the clocks ticking.
That's all I was trying to get at.
But
Yeah.
it's not when the documentation is provided. It has to be when the event happens. Because you could wait.
But
it-
then
it-
you're
it-
gonna kill a ton of projects, basically, because the determination, well, this deterioration and decay happened in 1940, and now you wanna come back and
Well, no, but there hasn't been a determination that it's irreparably,
so it is when it's determined to be irreparably damaged.
well, in that
By-
case. But if there's a situation where, getting back to calamity, if the house burns down,
That's a known event. That's,
well, right, but it's not triggered by the application. It's triggered by the actual calamity.
so what about in the other case when it's involuntarily damaged or
I
deteriorated?
think the issue there is you determine when, there's a determination when that becomes irreparably deteriorated.
When it's crossed that irreparable line. And that had to be by a building inspection.
But you could have situations where that could happen without application, where a property gets red tagged. Say a property gets red tagged, it's unsafe, and the person just sits there. And, it's the proverbial out-of-town landlord, it's some bank in Philadelphia, whatever, right? And they don't do anything for 3 years. I don't want to let them then come back in and say, oh, no, because we've determined that. But realistically, if someone is living in the house and has this problem and they come to the counter, I think that the date of determination is going to be then, right? But there are plenty of circumstances where you could have even the deferred maintenance kind of issue that to happen to be determined earlier. And I don't want that to go for more than 24 months. We want people to be done.
The process to be done.
Yeah.
But I don't want D to preclude someone from qualifying for this because we're deeming the damage happened
Right.
beyond 24 months.
Right.
And you're saying that's not the case, that's not the intent of D.
I don't think that's the intent. I think if we feel like we need additional language.
How would that be sort of looked upon?
Well, I think practically speaking, I would take it as the day that somebody comes in and says, I need to repair this. These are the pictures, and if you want to come out and take a look, that's
Yeah.
fine. That's really how we would look at it. There's no other way of looking
Okay.
at it. We can't tie
'Cause
it
you
to a
didn't know.
specific date when the termites started
Right.
eating the building.
So it is from when they
So
come.
there's,
But if the house were red tagged as unsafe,
then there's a date,
then there's a date.
yes.
So
So I think we would, I mean, this, I can see interpreting this
Okay. And
fairly,
To piggyback on that, the 24 months, I get that it sort of ties into, is that reasonable from, I mean, it seems reasonable, but it's possible it could go
It is
longer than that
um,
in terms of getting the building permit. This isn't just talking about from determining, all this, it's also,
well, I think
it-
that's reasonable. I mean, and there are extensions in the building code as well if a building permit expires. I think that,
yeah, I think if we had a situation where there was a giant fire and the whole canyon burned down, the city would say, well, and we can't process building permits fast enough, we would waive that provision. I think you really, this is the one house,
Yeah.
and you don't want people just to leave it in that state.
Okay, so then the last piece of that puzzle, Is there any need for, or is that baked into here where, for example, if it's deteriorated or damaged beyond repair, and we're gonna allow them to reconstruct, that the building official usually comes out and makes a determination to sort of corroborate
Verify.
your, is that just understood as part of A, the supporting?
It can be part of that, yeah, if the photos are not clear enough, or if, I think, we can work,
Okay. right.
with the applicant on that, I think
Now,
that's.
where you have, one thing we have to pay attention to here, or maybe, figure in as part of the equation is let's say after an earthquake or after the 100-mile-an-hour winds like 5 years ago, okay, you red tag something or you yellow tag something, and I'm speaking as somebody who's been qualified to, as a first responder, like after an earthquake. The red tag is not saying that the structure is irreparably damaged. It's saying it's unsafe for you to be in there right now, okay? Especially if there's a bad aftershock, right? I have professionally have certainly brought up to code buildings that were red tagged. The red tag itself is not, if somebody has a red tagged house and they decide that they want to rebuild it, then that's fine, but it doesn't necessarily, a red tag or a yellow tag is something else, and it really has to do with the safety about your being back in there until work is done. It's not absolute proof that the building is, beyond repair.
So did we address your issues?
Yeah, I think I'm gonna.
All right, are we back on page 2?
I
at the
have
top?
one more question.
Oh, bring it.
So close. One of the things that you've brought up a couple of times is I'm not seeing anything here, so I'd love to see it pointed out, that prohibits the rebuilding of non-legal, non-conforming. All it says is non-conforming, right? There's two kinds of non-conforming.
Legal non-conforming.
There's legal non-conforming.
Non-conforming always means legal non-conforming.
Okay.
Otherwise, it's a code violation.
Okay, great.
And
So
the
if somebody's built the
illegal
bootleg,
is
you
im-
won't
yeah,
let them.
Yeah, illegal is, or non-permitted is just,
Ain't gonna, yeah.
you don't get anything.
Perfect, thank you.
Cool. All right, so we're looking at the first box on the second page, and we've addressed a few of these things because we've now gone through it, so we should be in good shape here. Changes to non-conforming structures. Should they be allowed to be enlarged or structurally altered as long as the expansion complies with current applicable code requirements? And this is, I believe, a nod to what you just brought up.
Or that it does not increase the degree of nonconformance. Yeah, I mean, that's totally,
Right, and this is when we get into 1756-080, and then there's,
is that in the alteration part?
right, and so there's sort of two parts. One is alterations to deal with seismic and other code requirements,
Mm-hmm.
and that gets to what we were talking about before in C. But then there's alterations to enlarge, and that's in D and E, and those separate by structure and use.
D,
D is if you're gonna enlarge a
Structure,
non-conforming
okay.
structure,
and E is use.
right? And
Yeah.
so basically, you can increase the conforming part. So if you have, a part that sticks into the side yard, you can't keep going.
You can't make it worse.
The non-conforming
it
part. But the part that is conforming, you can expand that way or up or whatever,
Yeah.
as long as you comply with code.
My only comment on 1756-080A
Mhm.
was and maybe I'm missing sort of the gist of it, but elimination of nonconformity. Do we really want to say, I mean, to me, I put like to see this read elimination of or reduction of nonconformity, because there may be instances where you're reducing the nonconformity, which is a good thing, like a setback or something. But you're in no way gonna be able to eliminate the nonconformity.
Well, you can, I
Or
mean.
is that understood?
No, I think one of the issues there is reducing a nonconformity is not always obvious. You know, if you have a side yard setback violation and also a height setback violation, you know, or angle plane, right? And you know, you move it some, but you make one part a little worse and one part a little better. I mean, are you? And I think that's why a lot of times you don't get into this reducing just as a matter of right. Whereas elimination, if it's just not non-conforming anymore, it's pretty straightforward.
Mm. So what's the intent of A? To say, let's see. Oh, it's a subsection of the first paragraph, right? So alteration or additions to non-conforming uses and structures. Nothing in this chapter shall be deemed to prevent the construction, enlargement, expansion, extension, or reconstruction
I think
of a non-conforming structure in the following manner.
Right. And I think the point of A is just to state what should be obvious. It's almost redundant, right? Because of course you can eliminate a nonconformity, and so, you know.
Okay.
That's what we need to do.
So that's you know, one of those ones where you state something that you probably don't need to and is obvious, but you do just to make it really clear.
Okay.
Okay.
Yeah, if somebody only wanted to reduce a nonconformity by degrees, that's a pretty weird thing. And in effect, they're coming in and asking to build something that's non-conforming.
Right.
It's just a little less, so
And-
the
and,
answer
you
is
know,
no.
One of the issues is if your side yard setback's supposed to be 10 feet and you're on the property line and you want to rebuild at 3 feet, you know, is that better? I mean, in some ways, for
Sure.
fire code, it's worse.
No, it's better. You're not on the property line, which is worse. Like, I mean, literally, I think reducing a nonconformity is much better than allowing them to put it right back in the same spot, which, if it's a legal nonconforming use and it complies with all of this, you're basically saying, yeah, you can put it right back where it was, as long as it's the same shape, size, height. You know, you don't have to.
That is,
You know, we're not encouraging.
that is until you know, this is where there has to sometimes be conversations right up front between the building official and the planner, because you know, they may think that they can still do that until the building official says, well, that's fine if you guys want to allow it, except that from a fire standpoint, there's no windows on that side of the house anymore, okay? Are you okay with having no windows on that side of the house? Then maybe you start to think about
No,
it.
but from a conceptual standpoint, if we're saying, of course, if somebody has, that example is perfect, a structure right on the property line.
Right.
And we're saying, well, you want to make it less non-conforming by moving it from, it's supposed to be 10 feet, you're at 0, but you want to go 6 or something, 5. We're saying, no, you can't do that.
So,
Then you can put it right back, on the property line,
But-
which is worse.
But I guess it goes back, you know, it had its footprint, and the rest of the community was developed around that footprint and that placement. Now, can we put in something that says that they can mitigate their degree of nonconformity? I don't know. I mean, is there room to move it over?
Sure, maybe there is. You know, I don't know. But what I'm saying is, if they comply with legal non-conforming and they're able to, because it's whatever the reason is, they can rebuild, okay, the structure.
And they can mitigate the nonconformity.
And they could mitigate the nonconformity by making it to a lesser degree. But we're saying, well, we don't want that. Then you're going to put it right back. You can put it right back by right,
Where it
based on
was.
this, where it was, which was on the property line.
Which is a
And
greater.
potentially, you know, with openings or whatever. I mean, probably not because of the code.
No,
The
because
code won't allow it.
that's
But-
different.
But you could, the setback, sure, I'm sure the neighbor would appreciate it if it was,
3 feet instead.
3 or
Instead-
5
instead
or
of 0.
whatever, like, you know.
How often are we going to run into this kind of?
It happens. It happens.
Yeah,
a
well, no,
ton.
I'm not challenging you. I'm just trying to get a handle on
I think
if
it happens
it happens
more often
once a
than you
year,
know.
maybe staff has to bring it to us for a variance. If it's just a real oddball situation.
I think it happens in the R1, in the residential zones more than we want to.
What does staff think? Is
does.
this something
It
that
does happen.
that would happen frequently or not?
It does happen. And I think it would seem a little odd when we're saying, no, you can't improve upon this. You have to actually continue that impact, even though you're volunteering to reduce the impact. It seems counter, but
Do you just want to see that there's a very good case for why you can't eliminate that problem entirely?
oh,
That
sure.
you
I
can
mean,
only go back 3 feet instead of 5?
well, I guess,
Yeah,
but
sure.
I think that, that could be part of it, but also,
variance application.
yeah, that's more of a variance,
would be.
and
Wait,
that may
if
not be.
You're trying to make it more?
No,
less.
less.
If you, let's say you're on the property line
Mhm.
and you have the right to rebuild the damaged portion, and the setback is 10 feet. And you
Required,
wanna go
yeah.
only in 6. And while you're certainly you're lessening the nonconformity, but the question is, should that just be an over-the-counter decision, or should it come to the board in the form of a variance? Because one of the questions would be, well, you can go back 6 feet, why not the whole 10? So why should we let you vary what the development standards are for everybody else?
See, I disagree with
Well-
that completely, because to me, you're making it less non-conforming. And I think at the counter, you can look at, for example, this would be a perfect example. You've got a structure that's on the property line at the rear, let's say, and you've got another primary structure that's, meeting all the setbacks. It's, you couldn't move it to 10 or 15 feet, because now you're gonna make the space between the two structures non-conforming, because you need a certain amount of distance between them, 10 feet or 15 feet or whatever. So you're limited, but you can move it 5 or 6 feet, which would be applicable to your rear neighbor, your side neighbor, whatever the property's on. Like, it seems like if that was the case, I wouldn't go for the variance. I would just say, okay, well, I'm gonna put it right back on the property line.
So is this a setback issue, or are there other problems with with replacing a structure with the like structure that are?
I think it's mainly for location.
Usually setback.
So it's mostly a
usually
setback issue.
yeah.
Yeah.
Then can we
Because
put
that's
in,
where it
then
is.
can we put in language that says, in any effort to mitigate setbacks are,
Yeah, but
Encouraged?
I'm not so sure that I agree that any is better. Right now, with the way we've got this, is you can rebuild as it was, or you go to code, right? And if you try to make it worse, you need a variance. And we're sort of quiet about what happens if you reduce, but you don't get it to compliance. And to me, it just seems like,
Well, the current code
Okay.
spoke to that pretty clearly, actually.
You're really trying to write rules for what's discretionary here.
We had a section.
Well, not now. What we have now is no discretion. And so one of the questions is, you've got 3 alternatives. One is no, yes, or maybe, right? And so right now we're at no, and I hear Manish saying yes, and I'm saying, well, maybe I could go to maybe.
Well, but globally speaking,
Mm-hmm.
what's going to happen is, if I've got, and this is namely related to yards, which is all about location, right?
and
Okay.
I'm very sympathetic to this,
So if you have a structure that's legal non-conforming, and
because of setbacks.
and it's because of setbacks, and it's on a property line or within 2 feet or a foot, and we're not talking a garage, we're talking a habitable structure.
Right.
And I meet the requirements for legal non-conforming and being able to rebuild that structure. And then we're saying, but I have the opportunity to make it less non-conforming as it relates to yards, because I can push that structure,
A few feet.
a few feet, 5 feet,
Right.
7 feet, 8 feet, whatever, but I can't meet 15 feet for the rear and 5 for the side or something. but we're saying we're gonna need to, you know, that's not allowed. Okay, well then what I'm gonna do is put that new structure right back on that property line.
Right
Why
on-
would
right
I
on the
fight it?
exact
Why would
same
I-
spot it was.
Doesn't that same argument hold true with height, with square footage?
No,
I mean-
because I think we're saying those things need to be, height was one where I think we're saying
Building
within
code.
some latitude of building code,
Right.
you know, but you're not gonna, like, I think we've squashed that.
No, but
Like, it has to match.
No, but but keep in mind, this section applies not just in the case of a casualty, but if you just want to change your property, right? I mean, what we have here is not just casualty, because I think casualty is going to be sort of a rarer experience. This is, I've got a property and I've got a nonconformance, right? And now I want to change my property around. Well, what we're saying is you can eliminate the nonconformity, so you can tear down your wall that invades the side yard setback and you can move it to be conformant, right? But we're not going to allow you move it halfway.
So, in other words, this section does not address the casualty. This is something else,
Well,
you're
this
saying.
I think this is applicable in all cases, not simply casualty. So I think, and it's much more likely to happen in non-casualty situations, because casualty situations are more
Well,
rare.
then that's an important distinction.
And so if you have, you know, you're invading the side yard setback and you want to rebuild or whatever, and this is voluntary, what we're currently saying is you could just leave it there, or you can move it to comply, but we're not going to let you move it.
Part way.
Well, you can't make it worse without a variance, but we're not even going to let you make it sort of better, but not all the way. You got to either make it all the way better or just leave it there.
But I think there is a difference in treatment where if you're just doing it because you want to, I think that is fair to say, well, then in that case, you do need to comply. But I think that when you are basically forced to remove the structure, demolish because it's in such bad condition, I think that in that case, maybe different that, well, I'm forced to demo. I don't want to do it just because I want to get the benefit. But now I'm actually also going to decrease that degree of nonconformance. I think applying a variance to that would seem odd in that here's somebody volunteering to do it because they have to demolish it, but you're saying, no, we're not going to approve it through a variance process because we actually want you to continue to encroach as much as you did before. Seemed like it would be an odd thing to not approve and having somebody go through that process. But I think these are two different things. I think I agree. I think that if you're demoing because you want to, now you're back to zero. But
still, doesn't the logic still apply though? I mean, if you have a 0 setback and the requirement is 10, wouldn't you rather have a 5?
Yeah, but
And so even if there's not a casualty, wouldn't you prefer to encourage the person to
but I
move
think
to 5?
that the
Yes.
circumstance colors that logic in the sense of, in one instance, you're saying, I'm not forced to do this because of some calamity or catastrophe or deterioration. It's because I want to. And in that case, you obviously, you instinctually look at it like, well, if they want to do that and they don't have to, then they should have to comply with, you know, they can either maintain it or they have to comply fully, you know. In the other case, if you carry that same verdict, it doesn't make sense. Like if you're, because of deterioration or catastrophe or whatever, you have to remove the structure, you know, and put it back, that you have to either maintain that nonconformance fully or totally be conforming.
So
Like you have to have the latitude there to.
you're looking at a replacement of an existing. And they're not getting any advantage over with the replacement because it's going to be built same height, shape, all that. But if they have the opportunity to mitigate non-conforming placement, do we not want to encourage that
I think we would.
in either case?
you're not.
In other words, we just look at it as a project on a plot of land, and there is the opportunity to mitigate nonconformity in terms of placement.
And
I
you're
mean,
not
we,
taking advantage, you're actually helping it.
yeah.
In
Right.
one sense, you're making your own case worse in the sense of like you have less yard space or something because
Well,
now
you could, you know, it basically you're saying you just shift the house over.
if you're able to and make it less not non-conforming, then
What if
why
you
wouldn't
have,
you? Why
I
wouldn't-
guess one of the issues is, like, let's say you have a 0 setback here and a 10-foot setback on this side. So you're compliant here and you're non-compliant here. And then you shift the whole house 5 yards. Well, I've reduced this non-conformity, but I've made this one non-conformant now.
We wouldn't let you do that.
Yeah.
Because now
You've made one worse.
creating a new violation.
Well, what if
Exactly.
you're non-conformant on both, but you shrink the house a little bit so that, I mean, it's just, the point is,
All right.
it's
No,
just-
no,
it's
no,
like
no.
determining-
I agree with what you're saying.
Determining what is less is not always so clear. I mean,
But-
when you look at one wall invading one setback and you move it, that's pretty simple. But usually what happens is people don't want to say, okay, I'm just going to shrink my house by 100 square feet and move this wall just for fun, right? There's some reason they're reconfiguring lots of stuff, and that might invade something else. And often, like if you're in the canyon, you're going to have nonconformances all over, and then you're going to have to determine, am I net reducing?
Are we talking here largely about, excuse me one second, are we talking largely about like 0 lot line houses in the canyon?
No, not
That
just
kind
in
of
the canyon,
situation?
Anywhere.
But it applies everywhere.
Yeah, but do we, well, because you were talking about, I mean, a lot of what we have in the canyon, it's like.
We have a canyon zone that I guess we could call it, but
Take
this is
5 feet off of the
this is-
width of a 12-foot wide house.
any house on any lot in Sierra Madre that's been there for a long time. It's pre-existing non-conforming, because that's why it's here, and it's up against a side yard, which is probably what happened. Probably was it was the existing house. They split the lot, and now it's right on the line. And I would guess that's happened. That's one of the more frequent events. So now they have an opportunity to rebuild that house because either something fell out of the sky or the termites ate it, but there is room on the lot for them to move it over, but not in full compliance. So do we want to put in language that allows them to mitigate location nonconformities?
And I think to piggyback on that, I think there is a difference on what yard we're talking about as well. Like, so in your example, a side yard, there would be a minimum, like, if I came in and said, well, I want to make this less non-conforming, but I only want to move it a foot in, that helps nobody. Like that, there's no access, there's no, there's a lot.
If you have
Yeah.
back-to-back walls and then you make a space that's just going to be an attractive nuisance,
No,
you've made worse.
I think there is a minimum sort of.
I think, look, I don't think that, it seems to me there's enough weirdness involved that allowing that by right is a mistake. I think that, if someone's rebuilding from what was there, we know it's there, you rebuild. But if you want to deviate, it at least needs to be a maybe. There needs to be some discretionary review.
So
Well, see,
one of the
here-
things that I keep hearing is the difference between casualty and expansion, right? So I know that the code as written, as suggested, is supposed to cover everything. But it sounds like what I keep hearing is, talk to us on a maybe if this happened because of casualty. But we want to encourage people who are going to, by choice, do some kind of demolition to conform to the codes. We're trying to not encourage.
But I think even there, I think the same logic applies. If someone's going to start moving their house around and doing stuff, and they say, look, I'm going to reduce my nonconformity but not eliminate it, we're saying that's a good thing.
I think
right?
it's a good thing.
But I think we need to review. So to me, it would be a maybe in both places.
I mean, let me just read this, and we can. It doesn't have to be included, but there was specific language in our really bad version, where it says, where a building or buildings and customary accessory building, are non-conforming only by reason of substandard yards or open spaces, the provisions of this chapter prohibiting structural alterations or enlargements shall not apply, provided that any structural alterations of an existing building shall not increase the degree of nonconformity of yards or open spaces, and any enlargement shall observe the yards and open spaces required on such a lot. So,
Yeah, but we still do. I mean, this
Well,
code does that.
yeah,
It doesn't, that
but
doesn't
basically-
allow reduction.
yeah. guess it
I
is,
I think
but-
if you want, we can just say where we have we have A, elimination of nonconformity, we could put in a B that says reduction of nonconformity, and say, you know, you're allowed to reduce but not eliminate the nonconformity with an administrative design review permit.
I'm okay with that.
I think that's probably a good thing.
I mean, I think that can be determined, to me, really, I mean, you can figure that out with staff at the counter very easily, whether they can make something.
Well, that's
like,
why I think it makes sense to do it administratively, but you've got, if you're gonna have a review discretion, you gotta have the process,
Yeah.
and that's, you know, unless you wanna go to a full planning
No,
commission
no, no,
hearing,
no,
and I think
no.
that's
No,
okay.
we don't need
I
that.
think you can determine very quickly, like, whether someone can make a yard, whether they can make something less
There-
non-conforming.
There are going to be all kinds of circumstances. I could imagine that you're going to hear people come in with, and there, you know, we were talking about, can you move the whole structure over? Okay, well, you know, the wood is termite ridden, but now you're adding $100,000 to the cost of my project because you want me to rebuild my foundations 5 feet over? No, that's pretty cruel. You know, or you may have something that's like partially damaged. You know, a fire doesn't necessarily obliterate the whole thing. It's just there's a portion of the structure that is badly damaged. Maybe you're going to one foundation wall you're gonna rebuild, but you shouldn't have to rebuild the entire thing. I think you know, and I agree with you that saying, you know, increasing, you know, you won't increase the amount of noncompliance. You know, that doesn't say, well, you can't partially mitigate it.
Yeah.
You know, it's probably a good thing, but we should allow for some staff review, design review here, because they're going to be all kinds of, you know, if we're talking about casualty, they're going to be all kinds of oddball.
Is staff okay with that?
My only thing with that, and I'll leave it at this, is I don't want that to be another hoop, whether it's financial or whatever, because I want to encourage a project like this if it reduces the nonconformance.
Mm-hmm.
And so I just want to be, you know, like and to me, it's a very simple sort of thing in most instances. Like, it can get complicated, but I think in most instances we're talking about location of this non-conforming structure. So I don't want to, that's my only, globally, I don't want to put more hindrance because at the end of the day, I can just put it back
Right.
where it was.
Is staff
It's more
okay with
trouble with
this? And also, given the fact that, can we assume that future staff, because when this happens, you know, 10 years from now?
Well, I think, I mean, you can do it either way you want, but I do think that you are discouraging reduction of nonconformance, because who's going to want to pay $1,700 and wait 2.5 months to get the permission to reduce it, where you think that's a benefit? They would just put it back. I mean, that's how I see it happening.
yeah.
Generally speaking, there may be exceptions that
Yeah,
it's such a big deal.
then I have a
that-
problem with that.
It's not that, I mean, it doesn't take 2.5 months to do administrative review.
Yes, it does. It does.
Isn't it?
Noticing alone could take, well, first the application has to be complete. That could be a month, that could be several weeks. And then there's 1 month as a whole just of notifications.
Right.
And
Plus then a
the
decision,
money.
it could be. It could be.
Well,
I mean,
Hey,
you're talking about small projects, like $1,700, like, look, it may not seem like a lot, but to me, that could be a decision maker where you're like, well, I'll just put it right back where it is,
Yeah,
like,
I don't
and
know.
not deal
I
with
sort of
it.
feel
To me,
like
it's a hindrance.
the way people are going to do this is sort of a binary thought, where they're going to say, I'm just going to rebuild exactly as it is because I don't want to mess with it, or they're going to go, well, you know, I'm going to take this as an opportunity to redesign, and they're probably going to hit other kind of issues at that point, and I don't think that, and you know, we combine all the applications.
So,
I don't, for
so
this.
so
for
let's
this
go
kind
back
of
to the
thing,
building
I
code.
think it should be, if you're gonna reduce the nonconformity, why would we hinder that? Like, why, I don't understand, like.
Well, let's go back to the
why would we
building
put a
code.
roadblock in there?
If it's on the property line,
Sure.
and the building code will not allow, if they're, because they're gonna have to rebuild it to existing building code.
Yeah, you can put it. You have a 2-hour wall.
You do have a 2-hour wall and windows?
No, you can't put any windows.
Okay, that in itself may be an incentive enough to have them move it till it does comply.
No, not necessarily. I have 3 other sides. I can put all the windows I want,
Okay?
as long as they're 3 and 5 feet away. Trust me, they're.
You've
But-
done this before.
I put a block wall. It's part of my fence wall. That's my wall. My
Right,
building
your
wall.
non-combustible wall. And
Done.
that's your barrier, okay.
Yeah, well, that's going to depend on the interior layout, okay? Because if there's a bedroom, for instance, that is really dependent on having windows on that wall, and you say, oh, sorry, it's solid concrete block.
Wouldn't it be a lot easier to just move the bedroom?
But it was, but it
Layout,
was,
I mean-
it was there before,
This is
right?
why we have architects on the
The
commission.
thing is, just, I think that, to me, when it's the issue of moving it back 1 foot and creating a 1 foot gap between your
Sure, that's
wall
worse.
and others is worse. And so,
But why are
how
we-
do you write a code that says you can reduce it except when it's not so good without doing some sort of discretionary
But
review?
I don't understand why it can't just be reviewed, like,
'Cause
staff
you
is
have to-
totally
you have to-
competent in looking at that and going, are you kidding me? You want to just move that a foot? Like, that's.
But you have to have a set of rules for staff to implement. You can't just say, reduce the thing unless staff doesn't like it.
Well, and my point is that with this staff, we have assurances, but things change in Sierra Madre, and 10 years from now, we
Well,
may
then
be looking at
let's
different
write-
people.
Then I would say let's spend the time to write in those triggers, like it can't be less than, like you can't reduce the nonconformity by only 10% or something. It's gotta be, or whatever, a foot. Like a foot is ridiculous, okay? But if you're gonna reduce the nonconformity, namely for yards, this is what we're talking about, yards,
Right.
not the other issues, it's gotta be a minimum of 3, because code, 3 feet is like the closest
You can get,
you can get, because you can have fire rated glass and you can do all that stuff that you want to do. 5 feet's ideal, right? But the problem with 5 feet on the sides, most of our setbacks are 5 feet on residential lots that are standard, right? 5 feet is the setback, so,
Right, so-
so.
Fine.
What's the incentive for somebody to
But
want to
this
do
happens,
that?
no,
That's
but
the
this,
thing.
this happens more
what
like.
you're saying
this
is that they
happens
can-
more on rear property lines and front property lines.
But what you're saying is that they can say, you know what, 4 feet's really where I want to be. So I could have been all the way, but you're saying I only have to go 4 feet because I'm reducing the nonconformity. So I'm not even going
No,
to try to
no,
put that
what I'm
extra
gonna
foot
s-
in there.
no,
because
what I'm gonna
it's
say
just an
is,
over-the-counter.
okay, fine, you know what? The olive branch of trying to make it less nonconforming, I'm just gonna put it right back on the property line.
Let me.
And I'm not gonna spend the
let me,
1,700 bucks. and
What's
I'm
the
not gonna-
incentive to do otherwise is the question here.
yeah, there is no, the current, we haven't written anything in to encourage mitigation.
It's like, so you guys, you want me to make my 12-foot wide bedroom 8 feet now instead of 12 feet. It's like, hell no, I'm going to build it back the way it is.
Well, then, but
You know?
the other part of it is like
There's no
we got
incentive
used to
here.
it before, so
Yeah.
just leave the dang thing there. But I'm going to offer a compromise to move us past this, and that's called kick the can. Here's what I think we should do. We've talked about having a reduction of nonconformity with an administrative design review permit generally. Why don't you work on some language that we could deal that's of right just for yards that you think works, and we can take a look at it, because I think we can go around. The problem, I think, is, to me, it seems like there's a lot of different issues, but maybe they can be addressed.
So pertaining to yards, if we can put that language in specific guidelines,
Yeah, just for
then we
yards.
can then eliminate, because that would be instruction to staff, basically saying, if you're gonna reduce it and
Right.
you meet this threshold or whatever,
Yeah,
that
so
would
we
bypass
have-
the need
there's
for.
there's two ways, right? We can say generally, if you're going to reduce the nonconformity, you can do it with an administrative design review permit, and that would deal with size, height, all sorts of other kind of issues, right? And then specifically, there could be a vehicle for yards that could be of right if you meet A,
Okay.
B, C, and D.
I could see that.
And so if if you can think of some good language on that, we can take a look at it.
So
Because we're, at this point, going around it.
it's 10 after 9. When I became the chair, one of the things I thought about was that when we're going to have long meetings, we should break, because after a while, I don't know, our brains fog over. So can we take a 5-minute break and then come back? Because we haven't even finished this agenda point, and there's another one to do tonight. So let's,
And we can always continue the second agenda item if we wish.
okay, well, hopefully, everybody knows we go to 11, right? Welcome to the Planning Commission. So let's take 5, and then we'll.
Okay.
Yeah, Vincent, you did tell me,
say
you
we
did
go
tell
to
me this
10.
afternoon at least 10. At least 10.
alterations are allowed, such as seismic upgrades, building code upgrades, to comply with earthquake and building code safety standards,
Yeah.
and voluntary code upgrades. Also allow alterations to eliminate nonconformity.
Yeah, that's what we've just been dealing with.
Okay, we're done,
Should that say voluntary code upgrades or voluntary building code upgrades?
That's all inclusive.
Well,
right?
that's,
Huh?
yeah.
I think that's inclusive, because it could be, it's a building code, it could be,
It's a summary chart. It doesn't need to be accurate.
okay,
That's it.
so we can go to the next one? We're
well,
good?
just before you go there, does that encompass 1756-080? Are we passing that section?
No, I think we talked about A, B, and C, but we really need to
Okay.
deal with D and E.
Yeah, okay, so I've got,
Because those are, if we're gonna allow people to enlarge or on a non-conforming structure or use, as opposed to just alter because of seismic and whatnot.
Okay,
so D.
so what do you want? D and E, alterations and enlargements.
I had a comment on D2, but I want to hear kind of D1. I didn't. I mean, do you have
The
something?
D concept is just, you can make a non-conforming structure bigger as long as you do it in a conforming manner.
Okay.
You just can't enlarge the non-conformance.
Yes,
or
okay.
increase
So
the
the part
non-conformance.
that's enlarged has to meet current zoning
Right.
and all that.
Correct.
In other words, like if you put you may have a thing that exceeds volume or has a very minimal kind of side yard setback.
Yeah.
And if you were to put an addition on the back of it, then the envelope of that additional part would have to be in compliance
Right.
with current zoning. You couldn't just continue the thing back in an extreme.
Well, so here's here's one. I'm just gonna throw this out.
No, you're good. Actually, you're doing a very good job. This is all important.
I agree with that wholeheartedly, but the current direction is the part that's the legal non-conforming structure in this example has to meet sort of the footprint, size, height, requirements. Like what was there before has to be put back essentially the same. But as soon as the part becomes, the enlargement is within the current code, so in that height issue we're talking about, you can have two very dissimilar structures,
Yeah?
and we're okay with that. Like, because the enlargement's conforming, it's per current code.
I think the.
How do we look at that?
Well, keep in mind that this is dealing with what you can do with regard to the nonconformance. It doesn't change the zoning code, so that if what you're doing is adding a part that triggers some sort of design review otherwise, and we would review it. So if somebody's adding a second story, that's gonna trigger design review, and if it looks really weird, we'll catch that then.
Okay.
Right, but if they're just, adding a little bit on so that they just need a building permit on one story, that's hopefully not gonna be a big issue. But that really circles back to the issue of what our design review triggers are.
For that type of project.
Yeah.
Because okay.
'Cause you
I mean, I'm
gotta
looking
hope
at
those
I'm looking
things
at a funky scenario where I've got the non-conforming part and I build it, I put it back, per the non-conforming standards, but then I'm doing an addition to that that's within everything current, but I can, make that 25 feet tall.
Right, and
I
so then
could,
we're gonna,
you know.
but the second story's gonna trigger design
But
review.
what if there's no second story? It's just a one story.
Well, at some point, you gotta hope your design review triggers are good,
Okay.
right?
All right. So
And I'm sure there's gonna be some.
something that falls through the
some
crack.
Weird ones, but
Okay.
hopefully you catch most of them.
Okay.
Yeah, they may just have a lousy designer.
Yeah.
Or
That's never
or a
happened.
brilliant
Yeah.
designer. I mean,
Okay, so we're down to the third one.
Solve the problem.
well.
No, no, we're not.
Well, I just had one note here on D2.
Okay.
It said conflict ? Above, we allow relocation of non-conforming structures to meet the standards in play at the time. This should only apply to enlargement. This should apply only to enlargement. I don't know what that means, but a non-conforming structure shall not be enlarged or moved unless the
Unless.
enlargement or new location conforms to the current development standards identified. So if you move a non-conforming structure, i.e. like to
You can't-
lessen the yards or something, like
Right.
the
Like this, your example you've been doing, you can only do it, it's written here that you can only do it to be totally in compliance.
Right, that's right.
okay, so this is the part where it's all
Right.
or nothing kind of thing.
That it is. And so we would allow, we've talked about allowing reduction with a design review,
As it pertains to yards.
and, no, generally.
Oh, okay.
But then you're gonna work up some as of right language
Or
for
yards.
yards.
That would go in here.
But I would think if you're, I mean, one of the issues there is if, if, let's say you have the same amount of massing
Mhm.
and you have 1 yard that's encroaching, and you pick that up and move it over, that's a different issue than just moving that wall in and shrinking the massing.
Totally, yeah. I'm looking at the, well, I don't know, I guess we're not looking at any scenario related to that. It's more how you reduce the nonconformity, I guess, isn't in play. I don't know.
Okay.
It's more, if you're gonna make it less non-conforming pertaining to yards, this is how you would do it.
Right.
How you do it, like if it's reduction in the area, because that's shifting, now you're making it smaller, but you're making it less non-conforming on the yard, right? Versus taking what you
The
can
entire
by right
footprint,
have.
the
and just
entire
moving
footprint
it.
and
Yeah.
moving the whole footprint.
Yeah. I mean, logic would tell me that would be the direction most people would go, but.
Unless
that's-
they're,
that's really-
unless they go with Joe's example, like, you know, I don't want to have to demo the whole foundation.
But that's a project by project. I mean, there's no way to kinda,
Okay,
Yeah.
I don't know if you can design for both scenarios, you know.
okay.
Well, what's more likely is that with a very old, I'm dealing with one professionally right now, okay, that's just got timber footings. It's a historic building, okay, but you may have a situation where the deterioration is in the foundation. You know, there's seismic damage in it. You may want to pick up the building and rebuild the entire foundation underneath it. It does happen with old buildings.
Well, Okay, how about the third one? Vacation of non-conforming use. Should a non-conforming use that vacate,
We still didn't deal with E.
Okay, yeah.
E is the alteration or enlargement of non-conforming use.
This is for uses,
This is
not
for
structures,
use.
yeah.
And on this, we require minor CUP.
Yeah, I put a question there, but now I kinda get, since it's related to use, you want that.
You are, right, because it's not a design. Now, keep in mind, the alteration, the structural alteration or enlargement might trigger some design issues, which will be dealt with in the code
Okay.
normally. So there might also be design issues that are triggered, but just the fact that they're enlarging a non-conforming use would require a minor CUP.
Okay. I'm cool with that. I think that makes sense.
okay? Okay?
Yep.
All right, third one. The vacation of non-conforming use. Should a non-conforming use that vacates voluntarily or involuntarily be allowed to be replaced by the same non-conforming use regardless of intensity? And if so, should a vacation time limit be established? Intensity was something that came up a lot in our discussions, because you can, intensity can be the significant impact on the community. So and some of the examples that we were looking at is, you know, if you have one business or one use is replaced by another use, what do we really care about what's happening inside the four walls, as long as things like parking and traffic and things like that have not been changed? Does that make sense?
Mm-hmm.
You know, if you have a doctor's office and then you have an optometrist's office and they see the same number of patients a day, what do we care? But if you have a doctor's office and something else that is more intense, where people are coming, going at a greater, and they need more parking, then the use issue becomes an emotional problem for the community.
Right. And the concept here is, if you're doing the exact same use, we're gonna let you go back in, but we're gonna put a 24-month window on. That's what we
Refresh,
discussed.
what was that based on? I mean, there was some, I mean, we didn't pick it out of a hat. There was some
Well,
logic to it.
in the different codes we looked at, it typically ranged from a year to 18 months, and we wanted to be a little bit more lax.
Okay.
And part of that is, a lot of it really goes to the whole reuse of storefronts. And if they go vacant and then somebody is, trying to re-let them, we don't want, just because it's taken a little bit longer, to penalize that.
So I don't understand then, of what Bob was saying a minute ago. I don't understand why it says regardless of intensity.
Because what we're talking about is the same use.
But what if the intensity is really increased?
Well, but it was there before. No, the intensity isn't going to be increased because it's the same use.
But if,
Like a restaurant,
if an intensity changes, then we want to be, we're interested.
Yeah, I mean, sure, I mean, what if something is in operation is 60 hours a week instead of 30 hours a week? Yes, it does affect neighborhood parking, and I mean, we otherwise would be dealing with that kind of thing as a conditional use permit, but I think that there's some different ways that it could be arguable. To replace a family doctor with an optometrist it probably is no change in intensity at all. But just think about all the ways that, like, traffic hours of operation, that sort of thing, are really considered for a conditional use permit, and that is anything but, regardless of intensity. It's all about intensity.
Right. Well, if there's a conditional use permit that's required for the use, that's dealt with later on. If it's a use that's allowed by the code without some sort of specific requirement, then the code looks at the intensity to be the same. So if the code, and I'm talking about zoning code, not building code here. If the zoning code requires some sort of review of the intensity or the hours or whatnot, that would go with a CUP or a minor CUP. And so that issue really gets into how we address that in the commercial code.
Yeah, I'm just.
But this issue is really just an issue of swapping uses. And so we're going to allow the same use to go in. And I think really what the concept of regardless of intensity means is that you can, in some codes, they say if it was an office before, it can be an office again because offices are low intensity. But restaurants, because they're often high intensity uses, if you leave, too bad. And we're gonna start that new, every new restaurant, because they're a high intensity use.
As a member of the public, I'm just a little bit confused about this and the way it's stated.
Are you okay now?
No.
Okay, well,
I think it's clear in the code. I mean,
yeah,
the
I think
matrix is more just.
I think the regardless of intensity terminology is throwing you for a loop, but
yeah, it is.
But that's not in the code.
That's not in the code.
One of the things is when you look at a lot of these different non-conforming codes, right? Sometimes some people say once you vacate your non-conforming use, boom, instantly done, and any new use has to deal with whatever code comes in, right?
Right.
Other codes, like how we have this structured, is if you had a non-conforming use before, you can continue that use as long as it hasn't been vacated for a certain amount of time. And for us, we talked about 24 months. But there's a middle ground that some codes do where they say, this set of uses we're going to allow to continue even though they're non-conforming, but these uses, we find them so intense, so whatever, undesirable, that they're immediately going to cease. And so based on the different types of uses or intensity of the uses, they have a different rule. And like in Pasadena, they do that with liquor stores because they want liquor stores to stop, but if you had, a doctor's office that's non-conforming, they don't really care if you continue the doctor's office.
And what you brought up is the same use but longer hours, and you looked at that as a change of intensity. What I believe John is talking about is intensity in terms of volume at this, not in the longer day, but in terms of during the regular business day. In other words, you replace I don't know, a store with something that's a store that sees 5 customers an hour with some kind of business that sees 50 customers an hour.
Right.
And that is perceived to be a change of intensity because that's going to require more of the infrastructure in the community, and it's going to impact the neighbors more.
That's correct.
But if they replaced a store that saw 5 customers an hour with another store that 5 customers an hour, what do we care what they're selling? In other words, rather than make a list of these businesses that are low intensity and these businesses, in other words, we just said, hey, we want to keep intensity the same. We don't want to increase the impact to the community on the whatever is replaced.
Yeah, well, I understand what you're saying there. Am I the only one that's missing this seriously? It seems to me as though it should just be reversed, that it would be another non-conforming use of the same intensity is what you want to say.
Well,
what am I missing here?
I think it's the language in the matrix that's throwing through, because that language isn't in the code. It's just you get to replace it with the same type of use. So if you had a restaurant there before, you get to have a restaurant again. If you had a doctor's office, you get to have a medical office. If you had a chicken restaurant, you can have a burger restaurant. We don't go that level, but we don't. We're just saying. But if you had a medical office before, you can't switch it to a restaurant. That's a different non-conforming use.
Okay, so in other words, I'm looking at it. I should just be looking at this as the guideline. And the real answer to what I'm asking about is in the code itself?
In the language, yeah, and it doesn't refer to intensity.
Okay, thank you.
Okay. In the case of a single-family residence, if a single-family use has become non-conforming due to a change in the underlying zoning designation, can the single-family residence be restored after being replaced with non-residential use for some period of time? We were only able to find a couple houses in town where that was true.
Right.
One of the examples is right behind the Panatorium Cleaners. There is a small house that it actually resides in the R3, or no, in the commercial zone.
And the answer here is, again, it's the same. You can within 24 months, but also we talked about when the drafting on the C zone, we're actually going to allow that as a residential use there because it's on the side street. So this is going to become
moot.
We won't apply anyway.
Much less problematic, because hopefully we're going to catch all those issues.
Well, right now, the way it's worded, you had a house there, a residential use. It's a commercial zone. If that house disappeared.
Well, if the use disappeared, like let's say it's a rented house, the people move out,
Okay.
and it
Becomes a hair salon or
lays
something.
vacant.
Okay.
It can go back to being a residence if they do it within 24 months.
If it's past 24 months, then it has to be a
But
commercial use.
if it's vacant, or they put a hair salon in and 2-3 years go by, they can't go back to residential.
Okay. Well, that makes sense. I mean,
Okay with it?
When these kinds of things were addressed in general plan, going back to the 97 general plan, where there was a lot of revision to the mapping, much more than in this last revision, that one of the things that was looked at was the integrity of the street. In other words, if you have a street that's all like
residential,
like that block of South Lima, that is consistently these small houses, do we want to maintain the integrity of that? And what would happen if you started to let commercial migrate into that? So I have a question about why that one house is zoned commercial to begin with.
Well, that's a different ballpark.
that goes, you're going to have to go back in time to find the answer to that.
I mean,
Well, we're going to talk about the commercial code in due course, so let's
But you,
bring
John,
that one up then.
in this instance, you're saying there's only a handful of.
There's only a
properties.
handful, and once we get done updating the commercial code, I think there's gonna be none.
None,
But it
okay.
doesn't mean it wouldn't happen.
Well, my only
sometime.
concern in a global perspective would be if this somehow reduced housing stock and increased commercial use somehow, which I don't think is the case. Like if we took houses offline or that use, and then you could never go back to it because, but if it's only a few properties.
Yeah, I
don't
think it's,
And we really don't need to increase our commercial stock right now at all. It's, that's fairly weak, but we have more pressure for housing and housing of all sizes and, and price points too, right?
So if this inadvertently took housing offline, that would be a bad thing, but if it's only like 2 or 3 or 4.
Okay. Next one. Should expansion or alteration of non-conforming, non-residential uses be allowed?
yeah, I think we dealt with this already.
I think we
Mm-hmm.
massaged that.
Yeah.
We're okay?
Yeah.
Good. Use,
The yards, which we,
Oh.
Yeah.
Non-residential, we cover that, so going back, not specific to the language, the non-residential part, the language was slightly different, it referred to like
but
materials.
that's just in casualty.
Oh, okay.
In alteration,
It's
it's
the
the
same.
same.
Okay.
okay. Use listed as conditional use if a use that requires a CUP but that does not have one vacates and is replaced by the same use, should the replacement require a CUP? If not, should there be a time limit for the vacation upon which a CUP would be triggered? So we're back to the 24 months deal, so
Yeah.
if you had the chicken restaurant and it was empty for,
And you had a CUP.
and you had a CUP for your chicken restaurant, and 20 months later, you came back with your burger joint.
Right, and this happens, but it had to be legally established, remember, because we
Right.
still go back to that bedrock. So it was a use that was legal at the time, and then we changed the rules to say it needs a CUP.
Okay?
So it just gets to stay, same.
Legal non-conforming use discontinued, should they be allowed to reinstate within a certain time period?
That's the same.
Legal, so it's the same one? All right, we can see the end. We only have 3 more. Last page. Consider whether the expansion of a single-family residential structure where the residential use has been rendered non-conforming may be allowed as long as the expansion of the structure conforms to current code. Note that this would mean expansion of a non-conforming use also. Examples in the city include the property at 222 South Lima, which is what we just referenced, 40 South Hermosa, which is next to the church, and single-family residences along East Montecito Avenue, which is in the our alleged manufacturing district.
Manufacturing, but manufacturing piggybacks a lot of commercial.
Right.
So this is similar issue. You can expand, if this exists, you can expand with a minor CUP, but a lot of this is gonna become conforming when we revise the commercial code.
Everybody okay with that?
Yep.
This is pertaining to uses, though.
Right.
Yeah, okay.
Non-conforming parking in the commercial and manufacturing zones. Consider codifying the current policy to allow non-conforming parking to be grandfathered in and used as a credit towards parking requirements for a new use, regardless of whether the previous use was vacated.
Right, and this is something that I really want people to focus on, because this is not a Pasadena concept, this is a Sierra Madre concept. And so we talked about this at the last meeting, and we all decided we wanted to codify the past practice. And so you get a credit for what was there before.
Correct.
for What was required of the use before, even though it might not have that. But then we also talked about the issue of inequity between a restaurant that's credited with a lot of parking and then goes to an office, right next to an office that's credited with a little and then goes to a restaurant, even though they're both sort of already been parked because our downtown is set. And so the way that we addressed that was to say we can evaluate the parking for adaptive reuse, and effectively it's parked already. And up to a certain level, we're just going to allow that of right because it's too small to worry about. But if it gets big enough, we're gonna take a look at it, and we're gonna have, we're gonna have what did I, is it a minor CUP? So, if you look at 1756-090B, this is where this stuff lives. So in B1, it says, in order to meet required parking, a use occupying an existing structure shall be credited with the largest number of parking spaces of. And A is the actual number, because, you know, if they have the parking, it's fine. B is the number of parking spaces required for the use last occupying the structure or applicable portion thereof. And that B is the one that codifies the practice.
Mm-hmm.
I do have a question about that, because that's not always adaptive reuse. That's just a business leaving and another business coming in that is allowed in the commercial zone that runs into this issue. It's not only with adaptive reuse. Is that being addressed?
How is that not adaptive reuse?
Well, adaptive reuse to me is interpreted as it's, say, it's a building that is meant for something, and now you are allowing something else. You are adapting, like historic buildings. You do that for, you know, in that zone you don't allow that use, but because you're trying to.
Is it the adaptive word that's? I mean, could we just
Yeah, I don't.
strike out the word
Adaptive
adaptive?
reuse is a term of art related to what Letitia is talking about right now. So we shouldn't make up our own definitions.
Should be reuse, maybe.
I think it's just your typical turnover. You know,
Turnover.
a store leaves and a restaurant comes in, or a doctor's office come in the process of the commercial zone being, you know.
So we could just
having
call it. We could just say reuse
Reuse, yeah.
instead of adaptive. Yeah, I mean, if the adaptive
Yes.
adjective doesn't add anything, we should take it out.
It actually probably
You
confuses
confuse
it because that becomes
It
a
restricts
structural.
the application.
It is a term of art that
For-
is being
yeah.
used.
Okay.
The building sort of concept.
Okay, so we would take that. Now B, so B does what we've codified, and then C says for non-residential uses in the C zone occupying, and we came up with 2,500 square feet, but I think we need to make sure we're good with that. A floor area, the number of parking spaces required for the proposed use. So, if you're going into a space in the commercial zone that's already there, we just say you've been parked. We're not going to worry about it, because whether you switch from an office to a restaurant to a Pilates studio or whatever, the differences are so minor that, and we've got parking in the back, we're just going to say that's fine.
Okay, but what's the square footage trigger there? That's for,
Because at some point,
It does
if it's
matter.
big enough, we got to say, well, yeah, that's our theory, but we want to take a look
if
at it.
it's over
If
2,500.
it's over 2,500. And so one of the things that we committed to do, but we haven't gotten very far on, is trying to actually inventory the different businesses to understand
Sizes.
what does that look like. And in some ways, this is a tough thing, because our information sources are not, as you know, all that accurate. So we've got, you can go to the assessor's roll, you can try to estimate it on Google Maps, or if it's vacant, a lot of times the broker will say how much it is, right? But there's also different methods of measuring that, so they don't always line
Lease
up.
versus the
Yeah,
building.
for a lease versus what we would.
Yeah.
So, interesting enough, when we were first meeting and we were talking about this, Gina's thought was, well, we met in Casa del Rey. She said, well, this place I would be fine with. And if you go to Google Maps and you outline it's about 2,700 square feet, but the assessor only has a 1,900. And I don't know if there was like unpermitted
Something
stuff
in
in
the
the back or what, you know, and so,
Patio got enclosed at will.
yeah, and, yeah,
Patio,
you
yeah,
know,
so-
and so some of the other things, there's some vacant ones in town. Charlotte's Fine Jewelry is vacant, and that space is 1,580 square feet, according to the assessor and the broker. So, you know, that one could be reused without an issue. There's the lab that's next to that little clothing store.
Dimensions.
It used to be Hygiena Lab.
Yeah, yeah,
Right,
yeah.
is that empty now?
Yeah, it's empty and for lease, and the broker says it's 4,770. The assessor says it's 4,690, Google Maps, it's under 4, but it's multi-story, so you can't really tell.
Mm-hmm.
So that one would not work if they tried to take it from office to some other kind
Restaurant.
of use. We would have to review that. For comparison, Bank of the West, the assessor says is 9,000 square feet.
It's got another
because
two
it has-
Over
levels.
twice as
Yeah,
big.
and if you
basement
look
or-
at Google Maps, it's less than 6, so it's got multi-stories there
Talking
too.
about the old Hygieia Labs building,
Yeah.
though, isn't that, that parking really?
In the back.
Just included as part of the big parking
Right.
field in back?
Right.
So how do we, even though it's over 2,500, or whatever our threshold is, how do we even begin to factor that? I mean, or do they?
Well,
Or-
you could go under the other exceptions, which are that you would get credit for the amount of the use that was there before. So, office is 3 per thousand, right?
1 per 300.
1 per
square feet of
300, so
gross
it's
floor
a
area.
little bit more than that. So you would just say 1 per 300, and it has 4,700 square feet, and that's how many parking spaces it would be.
So
credited.
if suddenly there was a use proposed that was like 1 per 50, then we'd have to take a look.
Then it wouldn't be allowed, yeah.
Yeah, we'd have, okay.
So, in that case, though, it'd be over 2,500, so we would see it?
So, well, and then you get to 2 that says a use occupying an existing structure,
Mm.
whether conforming or non-conforming, which is credited with fewer than the number of parking spaces required pursuant to 1768 or otherwise in this code, may nonetheless be approved with a minor CUP upon the additional finding that the parking deficit will not unreasonably overload street parking or public parking facilities nor create a nuisance.
If I may, John, if you can explain, I'm not understanding, again, under B, parking requirements for, and we change it to reuse, of existing structures in residential additions. How do these exceptions apply to residential additions? I'm not clear on.
It's all downtown.
Well, it's,
Commercial.
in residential, if it was, a house that requires 2 and it had 1, any addition would be non-conforming, right? Because the house is non-conforming parking.
Any addition of a bedroom
Yeah, or,
would require compliance, but if
well,
it's addition to a kitchen or a bathroom,
well, but isn't it our standard policy that they get the credit for what if they were in compliance?
if they're adding a bedroom, they have to comply with the requirement.
Okay,
So if
that's,
they have one and add a bedroom, then now they need to comply.
that's not my understanding of what we did, and that's not what this code does. This code says that if you have, if you have a 2-bedroom house with 1 parking space, which under current code in R1 requires 2,
Mhm.
and you added a 3rd bedroom, you'd be fine, because you credited with 2.
No?
So that's what this code does.
Okay, so that were, okay, because,
And if we don't want that, we need to think about it. But what we did in 3 is we dealt with the issue of the fact that there's different parking requirements in different residential zones, and effectively made it that if you have a studio or 1 bedroom, you'd only get credited with 1.
in the R1 zoning code, there is a section specific that says that addition of a bedroom will trigger parking requirement compliance. So that then would need to be revised, so that
Well,
it's
would-
not conflicting with this,
That's,
in the R1.
but you're talking about crediting, like you get a credit off the bat. Like, so if you add a bedroom, you need 2 parking spots. But inherently with the property or the use, there's a
Well-
credit, right?
Well,
Is that what you're talking
one
about?
of the issues with the way we do this is that each square foot of non-residential needs to be parked, right? Whereas in residential, it doesn't work that way. It's by bedroom, but in everywhere except R3, no bedrooms all the way up to 4 bedrooms is 2 parking spaces.
Yeah.
So you can go from a 1-bedroom to a 4-bedroom house without changing the parking requirement.
Yeah, it's 2.
Right, and so that's that.
If you have to. but
Right, if you have to, right. So, and so that's why it's sort of different, because if you have, say, 1,000 square foot non-residential space that you're credited with X number of parking spaces, and then you add 20 square feet, you still need to park that 20 square feet. Whereas if you have a house that has, 2 bedrooms, and then you add a third bedroom, that third bedroom doesn't need to be parked if you've already parked the 2 bedrooms, right? And so that's why it's weird, because it's sort of a flat step as opposed to just a gradual thing. And so one is the issue, the policy issue is, do we want to give res the credit that we talked about with the non-res? And apparently that's not the way we're doing it, which is, I didn't understand that. But do we want to? And then if we do, we've set that up to work like that, to take into account the fact that in most zoning other than R3, if you had a studio or a 1-bedroom, you'd be credited with 2, which we didn't want. You'd only be credited with 1.
Well, we gotta first go back and just see if the credit concept is even valid.
Yeah, if we want that. Yeah, if
So
that's
what's-
not what we want, then
And what's the pro con, or, I mean, they're 2 different beasts, commercial versus residential. So right now, you have to have 2 spots. That's the first issue. If you don't have that, you can't even do an addition of a bedroom or whatever, right?
Right, that's the tail that
So-
wags the dog.
And that would ensnare, I would say there's plenty of properties where that's an issue.
Yes, we have, exactly, we have a significant number of little post-war ranch burgers that, remember, right after World War II, 1 car in the family was still the rule, because the rule was that Dad went to work and Mom stayed home, and it was the old. Look around. We have a lot of those things, and they're on narrow lots. And to say that you needed to, these are houses that are going to need upgrades. They're getting old. They're small, and by the same token, if you just drive around and look at them, and I'm agreeing with what you're saying. If you go and look at them, it would be a real a hardship, given the narrowness of the whole thing, to say, well, the one, a lot of them they have that one attached garage, the garage door, like right next to the front door, and it's kind of like. It would really be a hardship to say you've got to make that into a 2-car garage. It just isn't going to happen. So are we going to lock people in? The question is really going to be, are we going to lock people in to not being able to upgrade these houses?
Well, the other point that I would make is that in the canyon, you don't have full access for fire and safety now. I mean, people have parked so that you can't drive a fire engine on some streets. I mean, and we're trying to mitigate that with red flag warnings and stuff like that. But,
Right.
So in certain parts of the town, we need to get the cars off the street so we can have access. In other parts of town, down on the flats, there's plenty of curb, and the streets are wide enough so that it's not an issue. So, it's
Yeah, I was visualizing down on the flats when I was talking a minute ago.
yeah, but I can tell you that in the canyon, in some parts of the canyon, I don't know how the trash guy picks up the trash, because there are places where we would have a hard time getting a fire engine. So, and so I think we're going to have to look very carefully, or we're going to have to sculpt this rule. With a lot of insight.
I mean, globally speaking, should this exception even talk about residential parking? Seems like we may be better served addressing, because I think there's more involved with parking in residential zones. It's all those things, and it's a different way of calculating it. Like, does it make sense to be,
well,
I guess
think,
you kind of have to,
I
'cause
think
it's
the
about
first
use.
the first issue is more of a policy one. Do you want to have sort of the concept of we're used to it and we're going to let it be, apply to res the same way we apply to non-res. And if we don't, well, then it's easy to fix. We just changed everything to say non-res and strike all the res. But if we do want it to apply to res, then it functions that now everywhere here. But if we want to say, okay, that's a good concept, but we really only want it in this place or that place. I mean, because I think you've got canyon, you've got regular flatland single family, but then you also have multifamily zones, which are sort of a different beast too. And a lot of multifamily zones were originally created with the one car concept, and people have sort of grown accustomed to that. And do we want to require them to now start to comply? So, you know, maybe the answer isn't to say it's blanket across all, but we have to look at it separately. I don't know.
Yeah, I mean, I haven't really wrapped my head around it to really figure out whether, I mean, I think the parking thing, globally speaking, the idea, we talked about this from the very beginning, the idea of parking wagging the tail, to me, makes no sense moving forward. Like, I think providing relief on the parking front for development or reuse of spaces makes total sense. Like, I just think that's the direction it's going. I don't know in the residential setting whether, you know, I do understand the concept that the idea of cars as part of residential structures and uses kind of ebbs and flows. Like, you know, there is a period where you're going to have multiple cars, you know. Your kids have their own cars, you have your cars, you know, and then there's a time where
Kids move away.
You know, so it's not a constant, you know, but we sort of treat it like right now we just look at like you've got to have got to be able to park 2 up to 4 bedrooms, you know, and I think there's that whole concept needs to be looked at, I think.
Well,
so I don't know if this is
that's
the place
sort
to
of a
look
fair-
at it, because you're right, you need it says it completely different in the R1 or whatever, how we treat parking.
Where you see
I don't think
that zoning, you know, reduction in residential parking requirements, you will see like a 2 or 3 bedroom with 1 parking space allowable, generally are going to be in places that are building transit-oriented developments, TODs, and they're definitely trying to, with a somewhat misguided notion that we only use a car to go to work. Okay, you know, like we can take the Gold Line to the supermarket, you know, but it's here in Sierra Madre. I don't think that we're to the. Some people will be able to replace 1 car with a bicycle, but you know, most people really aren't.
But I mean, I think even the idea, like, on some of the properties you were mentioning, like these small, tight, 1 car, probably meant for a horse and buggy than even a vehicle, you know, I mean, these tiny garages, and suddenly you go to 3 bedroom, or you add any sort of bedroom, you've got to have 2 parking spots that are enclosed or covered or however it works. Like, I think that thing needs to be revisited a little bit, because I think that puts a little bit of development pressure or against doing certain expansions or enlargements or whatever, because you can't meet the parking, you know, and but I think that's a different, like, I don't know, it seems like a different discussion.
Would it be helpful if we broke away the commercial and the residential and separated them out?
As far as drafting the code, I don't think that makes any difference. We just need to decide what the policy we want. And it seems like we have a lot of consensus on the non-res, right?
Yeah.
And maybe this 2,500 number is something we might want to revisit what the right trigger is once we get a feeling for more size. But the concepts there are fine. It's the res we're having issue with, and it seems like, well, you can think of lots of examples on either side of the fence, right? You can think well, how about this one? I just want to do this. Oh, well, that makes sense. We shouldn't require you to have more parking, but then what about this one? You're like, oh, that's horrible. So, yeah, it seems like it's something we need to focus on more. And-
So should we circle back and pick this up then and look at it as a separate issue?
I mean, does the subcommittee want to look at it further? I mean, I don't know if there's more data that'll, not data, but more. I mean, can you guys fully bake it?
Yeah, I don't know that there's more data we're gonna get. I mean, there's, you know, I think that the general concept that is currently in the way it's drafted is that it's parked now, and so we've come to live with that. It's this concept of nonconformance that we've grown accustomed to it, and so we're not gonna get in the way of it as long as it doesn't expand egregiously. And one of the things we talk about is if you go from studio or one bedroom up to 3, you have to add one. And if you go above 4 to 5, you'd have to add. But if you went from 2 to 3, you wouldn't have to add if you only had 1, right? So, you know, I
Well, I
think,
mean, to me, I think the same concept applies to residential in the sense of like the idea of parking vehicles, you know, like I can't tell you how many projects I've done where we've shoehorned in 2-car garages only to have those garages become
Storage unit and the
There
cars are on
no
the street.
cars parked in there,
Right.
period.
well,
And that's not an acute issue here. I mean, that's just globally speaking, like that's just the way it goes. But cars dictating sort of living pattern and development, I think we're moving away from the car dictating that. And I think if you can park, you know, 1 vehicle or 2 vehicle, however that's parked, whether in some instances, like in the flats, yeah, there's enough street parking where you can have a vehicle off-site, you know, and on-site. But like, to me, I think the concept still applies there. But I don't know if we've fully vetted sort of,
well, do you want to?
like if we screw something else up based on
Well,
putting
but
this
keep in
language
mind,
in.
this is to deal with existing. I mean, the issue of how much parking we should require for new development, that's a bigger, broader issue. And maybe some of the concepts that we explored on parking for the R3 should be brought over to Canyon and R1 and whatnot. But that's sort of a bigger issue, so, I don't know. It seems to me that maybe what we need to do is just think about it some more and take the issue up at our next hearing, because
I'd like to make just one suggestion along those lines, and that is that the issue of street parking is some kind of relief, you know, and what you said about don't want to hear about it in the canyon. This is a very important thing. So I'm just asking the question about, given the kind of threshold you described a minute ago, practical terms, the little canyon houses like on tent lots and so forth, could they even expand to the point where it would trigger another parking space? I mean, you're talking about extremely constricted lots and...
Well, under current code, they have to bring to compliance, right? So you're talking about if you have a studio or 1 bedroom, and you added 1 bedroom, you'd have to have 2 parking spaces under current code, right?
And they still do in the canyon
Yeah.
zoning.
The only difference in the canyon versus others is that the canyon doesn't require it to be covered.
Yeah, okay.
So in R1, it has to be in a garage or.
And it can
or
be
covered.
tandem.
Yeah, in
the
the
canyon
in the
also.
canyon, it can be tandem.
Yeah, when you're out of space, you're out of space.
Whereas in the R1, you cannot be tandem.
Right.
That's another.
Unless it's an affordable project, and that's a whole nother ball of wax.
All right, so if there's particular parking regulations that disallow street parking in the canyon, then you're out of space, right? That's what it comes down to. So that's
So-
easy.
Here you're really dealing with this subsection 3, right? That's the residential part?
No, 3 is just the fix
Oh,
for the non-residential issue of someone going from a studio or a 1 bedroom to a 4 bedroom
yeah, okay.
and getting credited with 2
When they only have 1.
when we really only want to credit them with one.
Yeah.
So that, no, what three does is basically sort of impose, for purposes of existing properties, the R3 parking standards on everywhere else. So if you go from a studio or one bedroom to 2, 3, or 4, you would need to add one, as opposed to not having to add it all anywhere under 4. And of course, if we didn't apply this concept to res, we could just nuke 3 because it wouldn't
Apply.
matter at that.
Wouldn't
point.
matter.
But just to be clear, this isn't about building or changing housing size or doing anything to your lot. This is only about use, right?
No, it's about additions to residential. So if you have a 2-bedroom house, right? Or let's say a 1-bedroom house, you're required to have 2 parking spaces.
Okay, then I think that we should revisit it from that standpoint, because I think that this gives too much away. By giving people the credit to not have to. So I happen to be a fan on the other side of it, where I lived on West Miramonte, and anywhere you butt up against those R3s, parking's just a joke.
Right.
And the streets aren't wide enough, and not enough people park in their garages. And so I happen to have, similar to Canyon, right?
Yeah, right.
My experience is that we should be requiring more parking spots in those, and that you shouldn't get credit for just one. And so I love what it does for the commercial zone, but I would rather hone it for residential. So I would definitely be a fan of striking
The concept from res
the
altogether.
concept from res altogether and having a bigger discussion on that.
Because right now it's covered in the specific residential zone. It's unique parking requirement.
Well, whether it's covered or not, I mean, the silent, unless we provide an exception, regular code requirements would apply. So, the fact that you could even add a bathroom is a little strange, because really, if you're non-conforming with parking, you're building anything extra is sort of strange, especially if under our current code, a studio to 4 bedrooms is the same parking. So I mean, you could literally argue, well, I'm not changing the intensity because I'm through 0 through 4, right?
Well, I mean, that puts us on the whole road of, like, I think the way we tie parking to bedrooms, because the next logical step is bedrooms means people, means more cars. So that's the A to B to C. And I think there's something, I mean, we can go around
We don't have
that,
but we don't have another, I mean, we can't
I know, but I think we
take the
there needs to
census.
be a discussion about just that concept of deciding on how many parking spaces you have. So the more bedrooms you have, the more people are living there, therefore you need more
But we-
parking because you have more cars.
But we still
Well, but
see
that's
people that,
how- the math doesn't look at sometimes, that's just how it.
but we still see people that put these rooms in the house that call them anything but a bedroom.
I know, this is the
So they
whole-
can beat the parking
Well,
requirement.
And that goes down that whole
I'm a
thing.
big fan of going by square footage instead
Right.
of bedrooms, but we do bedrooms right now. I mean, if we want to redo the whole
That's a
parking
different-
concept, that's a different
Got
issue.
it.
But so
I think Thomas is, I think we kind of jettison, this should apply to commercial. And the residential thing, unless we can fully bake it and figure it out. I think that little
Which is a worthwhile pursuit, I think.
Yeah.
Because I tend to agree that it should be done by size. It's a big difference to go from 1,000 square to 1,500 than it is to go from 1,500 to 2,500, right?
well, you're right, or 800 to 3,999, which you can do with a lot of dens and offices, right? But
Workout rooms.
yeah,
Workout rooms, and also years ago, I heard a statistic that there were something, and maybe you could update me on this, that there was somewhere over 400 at-home businesses in Sierra Madre. I bet a lot of those offices are using bedrooms.
So,
right? And there isn't another car attributable to that.
Yeah, I mean, there's a lot to that, skinning that, I think, so.
And then there are people like me who have more than one car, and I'm living in a place by myself.
so, there is something else on the agenda tonight.
Not
We still
anymore.
have one more thing to talk about even on
Right.
this.
Okay.
So do we want to, do we have consent? I still like the concept of trying to bake in some res relief, because it seems to me that the overall concept that we've gotten comfortable with what's there, shouldn't change. But,
Well, I mean, okay, I would be willing to kind of pass the baton and study it a little bit more, but what are we studying, or what do we need to focus on looking at? Is it the subsection 3, or it's basically B, like B1, 2, and 3, right? As it pertains to residential additions.
yeah, it's B as it applies to res. If we want to treat res and non-res the same, or if we just want to say, no, we don't want to go there with res.
Because I'll admit I didn't really fully dig into that as it pertains to res. So, but I mean, I think we should afford it the opportunity, punt it to the next discussion, and see if we feel the same way.
If we separate res and non-res, I'm happy to move ahead on the non-residential, but I believe that I think that a more of a discussion on residential, because, what does it mean? I think it'll impact, our decision will impact the community more. I think it will be seen more readily than in the non-residential area. I mean, I think we're likely to hear more opinions.
So we postponing it, or we?
So what do you want to do? What's your pleasure? Should we come back to it, or should we just or should we just move ahead as a non-residential issue?
I'd like to come back to it, and if at that point we still feel the same. then-
I'd like to come back to it.
Okay?
We're our plan on processing this is to do one more discussion and then a public hearing?
We don't have to, we can stretch it out.
Well, I think if we had, I would like Gina to have a shot at this, because this was sort
Yeah.
of her bugaboo too, and I don't want to
Okay.
cut her out. But the other thing is, if we decide we want to kill the res part, it's a really easy code fix. So it's not like that's going to hold us up
Okay.
on the drafting part. So if we talk about that at our next meeting, then we can reach consensus and,
Well, yeah, we may resolve the issue at the next meeting, but I think it's something that we have to mull over a little more.
and I think that, on our long list of to-do, attacking the parking section is something we're gonna need to do eventually, but that one is also pretty fraught with all sorts of stuff, so.
Which is why we're having problems now.
Yeah, when I say I'd like to revisit the thing, it's not that I definitely want to hone it. I want to revisit it perhaps want to kill it after some more thought.
Okay, so we can bring it back again when Gina's here and chew on it some more. All right, we have one more to go?
We have one more issue, one is on the table, it says lots, we already talked about that, but sections on the last page, 1756-120, nonprofit organizations and places of worship. This code is taken directly from our old code,
Right.
and this is the only section in the non-conforming that's cross-referenced with other parts of our zoning code. And so, I brought it in. But it also goes to the whole concept of we don't want the nonprofit uses in the downtown to expand.
Mm-hmm.
And so, I didn't change the text at all, but one of the issues that we did talk about as a subcommittee is that the language of existing facilities on existing properties is sort of ambiguous, and we thought it'd be better to tie everything back to the date November 8, 1994, because apparently that's maybe when this was put in, I don't know. But we wanted to make sure that that was kosher with legal counsel.
But it was after that date, it was 1997, when the institutional zone was created in that general plan, so I don't, when it says places of worship in commercial zones, do we have any that have snuck in? Because I remember at the time there was a huge issue about congregational church being the one institutional thing at the time. It should have been institutional zone, but it was within downtown.
Right.
And so I thought all those things would have been fallen inside the institutional zone. So what's going on here?
Well, no, there are some parts that are commercial of the congregational church that they have storefronts, but they use them as church meeting places. And then there's also the concern that I think not so much the concern of the existing properties, but that the church might want to expand by buying neighboring properties and then converting them from commercial use to institutional use. And so the language here that says they can continue existing uses subject to CUP and may renew CUPs as long as the use is continued in existing facilities or is for expansion on existing properties which have tax exempt status. And so if they own the way I read this is that if they own the property as of when this was passed, which I'm assuming was 1994, they can expand an institutional use onto it. But the way Gina read it was that if the property exists, in other words, it wasn't a newly created lot, then they could expand onto it. And so the point was we wanted to just clarify that it's lots that they owned as of
That date.
As of that date.
As opposed to all lots that existed prior to
Right.
that date that they could expand into.
Gotcha.
So should the comma be removed, you're saying?
Well, I think we can clean it up. But I just want to make sure with
Bringing it up.
legal counsel, we're not retroactively. I mean, I sort of feel like the other reading is a stretch, and so if we're clarifying what we believe to be the current reading, I don't see that we're like backdating anything.
Are there nonprofit organizations or churches located in commercial areas that sprang up after 1994? I mean, do we know that, has this always been?
I don't know when. I mean, the big issue is there's churches.
It's a zoning issue, really. I mean, if after 1994 the zoning was such that you could not, it's not an allowable use, either as of right or with a permit, then it wouldn't be an issue. And I'm just wondering what the point of it is, because if the zoning changed at some point in time such that church uses are no longer permitted in a commercial zone, either as a matter of right or with a use permit, then they're not, assuming that's not an RLUPA violation.
The north side of the Congregational Church is in the new general plan shown as commercial. I don't know if you recall that, but it has changed to commercial. So the zoning will change to accommodate that change in land use. I don't know if that helps any, but.
I missed that.
Next to the Old North Church,
Mhm.
if you go towards Hermosa, there's a beautiful old structure that when I came to town and started on the fire department, that was the mortuary. And apparently the church has bought that and the buildings behind it, and they use it for their community, whatever their programs are.
Okay.
Mm-hmm.
And so it has gone from being a commercial structure to being owned by the church. Now, whether it's been rezoned for institutional, I don't know.
Well, it's currently zoned as institutional, but in the general plan land use map, it was redesignated as commercial. Though-
Including the Old North Church property?
Yes,
Then that
Yes,
church will
that is
be
all
a
commercial.
legal non-conforming use.
right.
This provision really can't unsay that, because that's something the city did.
No, but I don't think I don't think the intent is that we're trying to undo a non-conforming use. It's just to prevent expansion.
So if they wanted to build something on the other side, buy it and take it over on the other side.
Right. I will just say that to the extent that you allow expansion of other types of uses, but not a church use, there is the potential, under our legal non-conforming
Right.
code, there is the potential that they could raise an ARLUPA claim. So for calling out a use that of all the uses to restrict, this is the one in here, it's,
Very specific.
I
So-
would be concerned.
Could we change it to just say institutional uses instead of churches?
That would be probably better.
Okay, and
That would cover schools and.
yeah,
Yeah.
the other thing is, yeah, I think there's sort of two issues here. One is that the loss of commercial uses. The other, which may be problematic, is the loss of taxable property.
Yeah.
And so to the extent schools and whatnot are allowed in the commercial zone, if a church or other nonprofit owns them, I don't think we have any way we can say, too bad, you can't do that, right? I mean, it's
I agree.
yeah. And I think there was perhaps some desire to do that.
Mm-hmm.
Well, back in the 1990s, Congregational Church had a much different head about themselves. They were, had dreams of great expansion, and there, I don't know if any of you remember that, but they proudly showed the General Plan Committee these renderings of this huge church that they were going to build over on the north side of the boulevard. They were so proud of this mega thing. I mean, it'd make the Kensington look tiny in comparison. It was just, and the community went nuts when they saw it. But they since have decided they're just not going in that direction. I think we could just let it be the way it is. It won't invite any lawsuits, and because the parking requirements, aren't they for anything like a church? Aren't they much more intensive in terms of parking spaces per square foot? I mean, wouldn't with the normal zoning be the limiting factor there anyway?
It's number of seats in the assembly.
Assembly
That's how
use.
it's,
I don't know, but
That's pretty. Isn't that pretty dense in comparison to a lot of commercial uses?
I can't answer that because we haven't used that part of the code very
I don't
often.
remember that one, but maybe there was a big planned expansion of the actual church sanctuary a long time ago, but all the expansion that I've seen or been talked about more recently has been about schools,
Mm-hmm.
church schools.
And some outreach on the south side of the boulevard, across from the Old North Church. They've got a couple storefronts that they use for part of their programs. So it's program enlargement as opposed to worship. So,
Yeah, well,
but if John is willing to modify the language and bring it back to us for approval by city attorney, I'm okay with then.
I think the language needs to be tweaked a little bit. I mean, the concept of trying to eliminate non-taxable uses, non-revenue producing uses within a commercial area is permissible, and other codes have tried to do that. It does need some tweaking. It's unclear to me with whether this means you can only stay if you get a conditional use permit, or you can stay if you had a conditional use permit and we'll let you renew it. Conditional use permits normally run with the land anyway, and the renewal may not be an issue. So I'm just not sure what, obviously an old provision.
Yeah.
And
Mm-hmm.
I don't know how it's been interpreted in the past, so we could probably fix the language to make it work
Right.
better.
Yeah, the other thing is, if we pass the commercial code update at the same time, we could, take it out. But it is cross-referenced in actually, it's not the commercial code, it's the list of CUP uses.
Right.
So,
Doesn't in our institutional zoning, in the ordinance itself, it defines uses in terms of schools, places of
Yes.
worship, so on and so forth?
It does.
So if we didn't single out places of worship here, but we
Right,
just
we
made
should-
reference to
Right.
institutional only, then we'd have it covered without drawing fire, right?
Yes, but that's a minimum change that we
yeah,
should
yeah,
make.
but we also have to get rid of the concept of trying to regulate whether the people who own the property are for profit or non-profit, because we don't really have any place to do that.
Okay,
It wouldn't draw fire the way the place of
Correct.
worship thing would.
It would not.
It would not, so it'd be okay to leave
Yes,
that part in, wouldn't it?
Institutional use, yeah.
In 1756-100, there was a capitalized conditional use.
so have we managed to zip through item number 1 on our discussion calendar for tonight? Actually, we've done a lot of, and thank you all for your contributions, so, because we've managed to make good progress on this. Are we okay with moving on?
Yeah.
Any problems?
So I think we've got,
So question just on this, we're past it, but where does this go now? Does it go back for
Oh, it'll get, I think it's gonna get,
rejiggering and then come back?
it'll be reworked and it'll come back to us for at least one more look before it goes to a, public hearing.
Okay.
So hopefully the next time will be a lot less intense. So let me look to staff as to your recommendation on the second discussion item. Quite honestly, I expected this issue to be the bulk of the meeting.
The affordable housing?
Yeah,
In fact, the presentation that I have for you, which is a PowerPoint, to make it slightly easier to digest, it is a minimum of a half an hour. There are 14 slides. I figure that I will easily take 2 minutes on each slide. I'm afraid that the presentation itself will raise more questions than
I fully expected that.
it will. And so it's up to you. If we want to push it to the next meeting, maybe we can do it first.
So
Yeah.
can I ask staff, do we have room on the next agenda?
Yes, the only item would be, if we do continue this, the affordability discussion would be that, and then bringing back non-conforming.
So we have room on a future agenda.
Yes.
I think for a number of reasons, I'd like to do that. I think we need to give it full consideration. We're not, the state is not likely to act in the next 2 weeks on this, are they? We're not gonna.
No, not at all.
So-
The bulk of the affordable housing rules really act like a further cram down on local agencies. Because the state views cities as the bad actors. That's why we don't have enough affordable housing. It's all the fault of cities, because our regulations are causing the price of land to be too high, and we have regulations that make it too expensive to develop, and so on and so forth. And so over the years, there have probably been 20 or more different bodies of law that chip away at local authority regarding how you can plan your communities. And so this bunch of new laws, there's 15 of them. They really just add to what's already there. And what will make the presentation go a little longer is I wanted to give people who might not know this just a really brief background of what does the housing element do. And you know, why do we have these regional housing needs assessment numbers? Where does that come from? What does it mean? How does it plug into the housing element? Because the laws really have to do with requiring us to do more things to get our housing elements certified. What happens if we don't? It requiring more things that we're supposed to report on in the annual report that we are required by law, and we have been for a long time, to report annually as to, well, how are we doing on that housing element? How are we doing on those RENA numbers? And the law also, the new law, has some new teeth put into it. If you're not doing so well on your RENA numbers, they can decertify your housing element now. That's built into the new law. And so I would want to talk to you about why should you care about it? What can happen if that happens? And what are some of the exceptions? So I'm not sure how long I took just trying to give that summary, but I'm pretty sure that the presentation and the discussion you might want to have and the questions you might want to ask will take a good 30 minutes.
Oh, I fully expected it to take most of the meeting tonight, so.
It could take longer, but
yeah.
That's the minimum.
So are we okay with anticipation on that and for future?
I think so, and I think one of the things is just to remind everyone who might be watching what we're agendizing. We're agendizing an informational item about what state law changes and how they affect us.
Right.
It's not anything we're trying to change.
Right.
It's how we're trying to deal with these state law changes. And I think one of the things that we talked about in the last item was the putting SROs in commercial, and that's in the housing element that we're supposed to do that. And one of the things about that is, yeah, we can do that, but what we really want to do is make sure, however we define what SROs are, we get RENA credit for if anyone ever builds them, because the last thing we want to do is
Missed that opportunity.
have somebody come in and build 12 SROs and it for some reason doesn't get us any credits, but we still get whatever impacts there might be.
Right, we'll definitely get the credit. And one of the big takeaways is don't make promises and create policies in your housing element that you don't intend to act on. Because the state is going to start to punish you if you don't. They can't force you to build anything, that's impossible. But if, for example, you identify a portion of the city as a good place to build, for example, a certain number of affordable units, low-income units, we'll say. And, you know, city doesn't own the land, it's in private hands. So a private developer comes in and says, I don't want to build affordable rental units in that spot. I own this land, this is expensive land. I want to put a couple of market rate homes because that pays better for me. And there is punishment now if you let the developer do that, because you'd better have another spot that you can identify in your housing element. Better yet, it should have already been identified in your housing element that you had another spot already that you identified in that housing element for those affordable units, because now you just took away the place they could have gone because you let the guy build market rate. These are some of the things.
If you force that guy to build, you say, we're going to deny your market rate project, then he's going to sue us.
That is one of the
Yeah,
questions.
it's gonna put us in a squeeze about a taking.
Exactly. That's one of the concerns and the questions is, since the state is telling us we can't do this, or if we do it, we have to do these other things to make up for it, is that a basis for just saying no? And they don't answer that question. And there are so many other questions that,
They just don't want to recognize that we're out of resources in California.
well,
Okay, and
yeah.
some people are still pushing to keep on building more, right?
It's a little hypocritical because one of the greatest constraints for housing development was the elimination of redevelopment and the taking away of the low and mod funds, the 20% off the top.
Mhm.
That's gone now. There is nothing to take its place. Although some of the bills, a couple of them actually would have to go to ballot to be approved, would seek to create new bonding opportunities. And one of the ones, for funding, to replace all the funding that has been lost, because it costs just as much, it actually costs more to build affordable housing units than market rate. And a developer's not going to take less money by building affordable. So something has to make up the difference, and that's normally a subsidy from some source. The state cannot force cities to create a subsidy program. That certainly hasn't happened yet, and it's not in this batch of bills. One of the things that is in the new batch that will apply to everyone is there's a new recording fee which goes into effect in
$75, yeah.
$75 per page.
Per page?
Per page.
Oh
But
my
it's capped at $225.
Oh, I thought it was just I read $75, so I thought it was just the one.
You're thinking, well, it's not so bad. It's per page.
Oh, geez.
But up to, like I say, the $225. And there's another exception for the
Missed that part.
sale of a house that is going to be owner occupied. You're exempt from that if that's what the real estate transaction is. But I could go on and on.
There was a bill in the legislature who wanted to raise $9 billion for low-income housing and put a bond. And,
that is one
put
of
that on
the
the taxpayer,
Yep,
too.
that is one of the new bodies of law that
Apple and
seeks to
Google
do that,
do
but
it.
it has to,
Plenty of
they're
chump
gonna
change.
put it on the ballot.
I know in anticipation that I will have questions about
God forbid this should be.
what your recommendations are for this body in terms of what we should be thinking about, and whether, what we would need to think about in order to respond to the, so, you don't have to say now, but there are still some empty plots of land in Sierra Madre, but very few, and we still have a housing element, and, is any of that going to be impacted?
Well, the city's housing element is certified and it's in place until 2021. You're on an 8-year cycle.
Oh, good.
And as long as HCD, that's another thing, HCD, because they get their information about what's going on in your city when you file the annual reports, which are required by law and have been for quite some time. And if you don't file them within 60 days of the due date, you could be considered to be non-compliant in your housing element. And so these are some of the new penalties that HCD could say, well, you're not following the law in all these other areas, so we're going to decertify your housing element and put you back on a 5-year plan. And they'll look at your housing element and see, well, if you promised to rezone some land somewhere in order to meet your RENA numbers, did you actually rezone it within a 3-year period? Oh, you didn't do that? That's another compliance problem. And so there is a lot to talk about.
Okay, well, good thing we'll have a whole meeting to do it.
Yeah, joy.
Okay, so at this time, additional opportunities for people to address, and seeing no one in there, I will pass on. Any messages from the commission? No, we're all good?
I would like to just mention, some of us were at the grand opening or whatever
Dedication,
it was,
yeah.
dedication for the
Highland Muse.
Highland Muse. Not that there's a muse there wasn't, but that's the name of the project. I think that it's a good example that we might publicize or give them some kudos on as an adaptive reuse, they definitely improve the architecture of the building. Sometimes when you do adaptive reuses, there are if it's not very skilled, there are awkward things that happen to the architecture on the outside, and in this case, they certainly improved it, don't you think?
Yeah, I think I think we're very lucky in its timing because we can point to that as also affordable housing, that has the acceptance of the community.
And it's mentioned in the housing element quite a bit.
And so, what I'm afraid of is people think about affordable housing and their image of that structure is not great, so.
Yeah, and that particular development would not have been possible without multiple subsidies.
Mm-hmm.
The subsidy from the city came in the form of conveyance of the land for, for nothing.
Yeah, they spoke about that today.
And then they had subsidies from the county. And otherwise, Heritage Homes is a pretty skilled and well-known affordable housing developer. But even though they're nonprofit, they still have to make some money, and they can't do it. They don't get any credit for the cost of the materials or the labor or anything, so it's expensive to build affordable housing.
Mm-hmm.
So it really is a good example from the community standpoint as well as just from the architectural standpoint. And it'd be great to have another couple of opportunities that way.
Right.
Of course, the part of the reason that they produce good work is that I understand that they actually are a spin-off some time ago from Pasadena Heritage.
Yep.
I think that's correct.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
So
but they're separate now.
yeah,
And
they
I'll
are.
just throw out that the other thing that made that project possible is that property was originally a part of property that was assembled and acquired through the redevelopment agency. And otherwise, it probably would not have been available for adaptive reuse. And because the city had, or the redevelopment agency had identified it in prior housing elements as the opportunity site for affordable housing development, the state was unable to take it. Otherwise, we would have been forced to sell it at market rate and throw the money back to affected taxing entities.
I know it was slated for high-intensity development at one point.
Right.
13 units.
So, good for us. It's a,
But just to keep in mind the scope of our issues, our RENA numbers for this cycle are 55 of all different income categories. That's 3 units.
so, we're gonna, so we,
It's actually worse than you think. It's 138. That's our current RENA.
But that's, the 138 includes rehabs
well,
and
it's
whatever.
everything.
It's 55 for new units.
For above moderate,
So,
Yeah.
there you go.
76.
so, we're gonna look forward to those numbers, because
No, we're not.
that's gonna,
No, we're not.
so, anything from
Staff?
staff?
We'll go ahead and definitely include the affordable housing discussion and the various bills on the November 16th meeting, which is our next meeting. Non-conforming uses will try to, basically, our packet would have to be going out fairly quickly. I'm not sure how much time. We talked about some of the commissioners revisiting some sections that we discussed this evening. If we can't bring it back for the second meeting in November, on November 16th, the other issue is the next meeting would be December 7th, which is also the same evening of our honorees dinner for volunteers. And that's going to be held over at the Sierra Madre room at Sierra Vista Park. So depending upon how many people wanted to attend that event, we might even end up canceling the December 7th meeting, but it's going to be up to the commission.
Is Gina Was she planning to be out the second meeting?
I did not have that noted. I thought she was going to be here on the second meeting.
Okay. I
She
don't
said it
remember.
depended on her jet lag.
Oh, okay.
Mhm.
Because I don't want to, postpone it specifically to bring Gina and then put her on a meeting that she's not going to be here.
Right.
Do we have anyone who, I've gone to those meetings in the past, but that's only because I've been moving off the commit, when I finished one, and is there anyone who's gonna go, who is planning on going to, Bill? No?
I didn't plan on
Does staff have to attend, or is it a command performance?
Typically, staff does attend.
Why did they put it on the same night as our
You know,
meeting?
well,
So we cancel and
Yes.
Well,
it's a rhetorical.
we'll take staff's under advisement on what you have to do, because you know,
Yeah, I mean,
but it doesn't look like the members of the commission are dying for a free meal. So,
but where does
Well-
that put our thing?
Does
May
it
not
give
be-
you enough time to work on the revisions and,
Well,
provide it back for the
when do you need it
following?
back? Let's work that way.
Well, I don't think the revisions on the text are all that much, because we talked through a lot of the issues. I mean, there's tweaking a word here and there. It's really an issue of if Gina's gonna be here
Yeah.
to talk about that.
'Cause, I mean, I can get my little section by next week.
Yeah.
okay.
And then we could talk about the bed and breakfast thing too. That's really quick. If we wanna do that.
Gina, we don't know.
Well, if she'll be here next week, well, we'll see.
Well, we can just, we can do the stuff, and then if Gina can't make it, we can just punt again.
Okay.
I don't think we're gonna really have enough time,
Okay.
because our packet would actually have to go out next week.
by next Friday, unless you think that's enough time to give it to staff with
Yeah, I don't
whatever
think
revisions.
We're talking about huge revisions.
I mean, I can
If
have
you
my
think
little
that's-
section.
Okay, it's up to you, if you can do it by, I don't know, say Thursday or Wednesday or Thursday of next week.
Yeah, that's doable.
No, actually, no, it would have to be Wednesday, because the packet goes out on the 9th.
Because Fridays you're off. Friday you're dark.
Right, it would have to be no later than probably end of the day on Wednesday.
Yeah.
On the 8th, if that's okay.
That's doable.
You want me to send mine to you? Or
Sure.
Okay.
Okay. Well, excellent. We have 10 minutes early. So we're adjourned? Okay.
Or something else to talk about.